c'est Bordeaux-Montaigne. Et Catherine, tu peux expliquer comment va se dérouler la session de l'après-midi, pour des raisons d'organisation, de voyage, de présence et d'absence. Nous allons entendre Sue Wiseman pour commencer. Nous poserons des questions à Sue, parce qu'après, il se peut qu'elle ait besoin de partir avant la fin de la séance. On ne veut pas la bloquer. D'accord? Ensuite, nous écouterons Kiawna et nous ferons une pause de 5 minutes pour mettre en place un enregistrement de notre dernier intervenant. Et alors, est-ce qu'on va poser des questions finalement pour chaque personne individuellement, tel que ça se décide? Peut-être ça pourrait être la meilleure chose. En fait, we'll be asking questions to each person when they finish their talk. It might be the easiest way to get them. So, I have the pleasure this afternoon of introducing a distinguished speaker, Sue Wiseman, Professor of 17th Century Literature from Birkbeck College, University of London. She's the author of 4 books on Afro-Ben, Drama and Politics in the English Civil War, Cambridge University Press, 1998, Conspiracy and Virtue, Women Writing and Politics in 17th Century England, 2006, Oxford UP, and Writing Metamorphosis in English Renaissance, 2014, at the Cambridge University Press. She has also edited and co-edited 6 volumes. She has also recently written on topics including the captivity narrative, complaint, wolf transformation, and wild children. Her current interests include the writing of Night 1540, 1650, and particularly investigation of cases from the English Renaissance, from the elites and yeomen of Derbyshire to the widows of Shoreditch, as suggested by literature, culture, and material editors. Last but not least, Sue Wiseman runs the London Renaissance Seminar with Dr. Elizabeth Scott-Bowman. Today she will be giving a talk on Shakespeare, his sister, and her status.
Thank you, and I'm so sorry about my awful mistiming. And thank you for such a fascinating. No? Fascinating. Yes. Such a fascinating conference, which being in person was a great novelty, but I think it could really catch on as opposed to catch it out. So please continue, and thank you so much for asking me. I have given the paper as an in-person conference for I can't remember how long, so I can't remember how it happened. And thank you. I've had a fascinating and very, very enriching time, and I've loved listening to the talk. So thank you for getting this going on this in-person bid again. I'm not sure how much I have to add to the fascinating papers, which I did find fascinating, but I'm going to think just a little bit about gender and education, and I'm taking the starting place, that most tendentious of plays, Shakespeare's version of the culturally pervasive Shrew story. As Dick Callahan's paper showed, and the one on the game of Elsinore, in which somebody could only be themselves when they were playing Kate, which was that in Elsinore or one of the other games? It seemed great. We find that this play is indeed very good to think with. It helps us to think about the culture that produced it and on what we want to do with the culture that is left to it. So I'm only going to talk on a very, very narrow canvas in relation to that, with the idea of education entailing the shrew, and I want to offer 2 additional contexts to it from zones of culture in which women were more closely associated than in that play, as we have it at least, with the education and learning in question, which is in a way education for being a good human and education for being a woman. I hope maybe that I can use these contexts to add some neutral light on play And I want to think both about the play's tendentious insistence on fixity of identity and what seems to be an entirely simultaneous tendency in being itself a version or retelling, and no doubt experienced as a version or retelling by its first audiences, and by emphasis on role, learning, and deviation, as well as reiteration of role and repetition. So I think to begin thinking about gender and education in early modern England, we could start with a forceful script for household education. Mother, who made you? Child, yes, God. Mother, why did God make you? Child, to serve him. The violent potential of education is strikingly visible in this catechism. But what are we to make of its educational delivery by a mother to a child? The child is indifferently male or female. Designed as a tool of specifically maternal ritual oral education, the set form designedly guides the energies of women educators themselves, most likely to be graceless traitors, almost as much so as uncatechized infants. However, it does so at a moment when female literacy was at the beginning of a period of steady growth. This catechism then offers an example of a simple text that has quite complex implications. Once we dig into it, there's a lot to ask about it, and it invites us to think about how the education themes of Shrew and the rich range of writing on education on and by women help us to investigate the work of education in shaping marriageable subjects. Taming of the Shrew plays out repeated themes of teaching and learning. I really have nothing to add in the line of different criticism. I'm not very good at it, but I'm just going to run through the classic themes of education, I'm afraid, and I would love to know more about them because I have absolutely nothing new to say about them. When Bianca's being educated, two things happen. First, the classical story from the Herodes she's telling is intercut with erotic pedagogy. I have told you before, the disguised Vicentio repeats. I am Vicentio, the son of Vincentio of Pisa, disguised thus to get your love. To which she replies, I think, this is what my mother would like me to say if anybody had ever approached me about anything. Presume not, despair not. Second, she also, like the child in the catechism, follows the exercise in repeating the Latin word for tutor ordain. It's a translation exercise, yes, but it's not one in which she's supposed to reply. She's supposed to repeat. And famously, of course, she both repeats and goes freeform. You mustn't despair. She speaks for herself. The injunction to learn by repeating, not by replying, is of course most violently asserted in the naming of the moon and the sun by order, not actuality, and possibly in a scene which might be played as disturbing or might be played as completely fine, when Petruchio overrides Kate in the street by insisting that she kiss him or kind of outing the court off. I don't know about that scene. I'd be interested in your angle. Only the three women in the play, Kate, Bianca, and the widow, are taught and in varying degrees learn by teaching in the mode of contradiction, thwarting, and physical punishment. The scenes of tutors and of named and renamed greater and lesser life are Shrew's acknowledged themes of female education. As M.J. Kidney succinctly comments, it's because of these themes that the play is regarded as one of Shakespeare's most difficult comedies. However, although the themes of learning are much visited and very productively visited by critics, I haven't been able to find that much that looks on them as education. So I'm hoping that you're going to give me some angle and that there's so much Shakespeare criticism that it seems to be entirely possible that I've missed like a whole message continent. I did look, and I looked in what seemed to me the usual places and the usual search terms, but I didn't find very much. I find a lot of people worrying about teaching the shrew, which makes sense, but not people worrying about teaching in the shrew. So the three things I found sort of helpful is the one article by Elizabeth Tutchian, which I can come back to and talk about if you want, which I find quite problematic, and Jess Dolden's very interesting book on education themes in romance. And as I was going through it, unfortunately I didn't have time to re-see it, but I increasingly thought about a twin for this text, being Almodovar's Bad Education, which is in the mode of melodrama. Some of you will know it better than me. It's an extremely interesting film in which bad education produces bad people, not good people. I think that's basically, it's really, really one of the really interesting ones in which he really works through the idea. And it came to live with me a bit as a pair of shrew in which bad education produces what you might call, it produces the effects, bizarrely, that is usually denied in Renaissance comedy. The one thing that I would take from Hutchins' article is that I agree with her that this is not set in a high mercantile world. It's set in the kind of world where women want to buy cats, and there's a definite overlaying of trade. So it takes education from female education to a place where apparently it would happen, but it's not that far up the social scale, and it's urban trade mercantile, not urban mercantile, which you might borrow money from you, if that makes sense, with a rough state of demarcation. In thinking about how to interpret the gender politics of a comedy that dramatizes a woman married against her will and tamed by her husband, that's MJ Kidney again, the play's jostling themes of education and obedience, often not answers, but striking condensations of issues, which at the same time as existing in the play, have echoes and contrasts in wider society. For example, if Bianca and Kate are stranded in the play without even the chocolate teapot that Juliet gets from that nurse, women were in fact deeply involved in education, all up and down the social scale. And I'm just going to run through a few examples. So one of the ones that you might know more about than me, and that's the most obvious, is Kat Astley and Thomas Seymour. So Thomas Seymour gets hold of Princess Elizabeth and cuts her dressing ribbon. And then there's this strange scene of apology recounted by Kat Astley, the tutor, in a deposition, where Astley says, the Queen and Thomas Seymour held her down, and by the time I turned up, the education had gone wrong. And this seems to be very interesting in that Astley gets to call her hero in the tower. She's thought to have played on both sides, sponsoring Seymour. It has the no clothes thing that recurs all the way through Shrewsbury. It's obviously in some sense quite a violent form of courtship. There's a whole set of things going on about consent, and all these things are located in the schoolroom, in the female schoolroom. The whole thing is enacted between the tutor and her charge, who she is, of course, incapable of disciplining. If who knows what Elizabeth is doing? I mean, I don't know what anyone is doing. Obviously, what we have is her deposition. And it seems to me that that's quite interesting in that it foregrounds two things: the erotic moment of women's coming of age being closely associated with education in ways that is qualitatively different from the eroticization of boys, and at the same time, the importance of the educator as the moral guardian. So moving on to the moral guardian, this figure is absolutely everywhere. The female moral guardian is everywhere. It's in the play, but it's also all over the conduct literature. So the female guardian educator, this hybrid, appears in idealized forms as the imagined agent of education and the dedicatees of the conduct book. For example, the necessary, fit and convenient education of a young gentlewoman, 1598, includes a translation of its original dedication to the wise and virtuous gentlewoman who was supposed to give it to her daughter. This text also reminds that figure, the guardian figure, of how important it is to patrol status boundaries amongst women. She must always be wary that she be not acquainted with maids, servants, and other prating women, staying by the fire to hear their tales and prating speeches. Be careful to follow the steps of her betters. The apparently cheaper, printed, female-authored The Mother's Counsel or Live Within Comfort, 1631, that one, nice picture. Contrasts chastity and wantonness, temperance and madness. That madness is the alternative to temperance. I just think I can't be true. The frontispiece casts Pollux as a concentric circle with at its core an image of a woman pointing at a girl and holding a book that seems to me probably to be a Bible. Instruction of women by women is at the centre of many educational texts and is assumed to be happening the whole time. In the Monument to Matrons, 1582, and you'll be more familiar with this than me, Dorcas Martin's catechism and prefatory poem shapes the reader as one catechized and catechizing, and in the 1640s, the non-elite Kent woman Dorothy Birch joined a growing band of women who were publishing their catechisms. The reach of maternally and sororistically conveyed education beyond God, specifically God, is very evident in the writings of educated girls. So Grace Marmade's granddaughter mixes pen practice and moral self-instruction as she writes, "The safest counsel make thine own, from whore and lust fly and abstain, for after pleasure follows pain." No, I'm saying. Famously, Martha Molesworth reflects on her Latin education at the age of 55, commenting on her father that by him I was brought up in godly piety, in modest cheerfulness and sad sobriety, nor only so, beyond my sex inclined, he did with learning Latin deck my mind. And why not? The muses females are, and therefore of us females taking care. 2 universities we have of men. Oh, that we had but one of women then. She does go on to say that if Latin was all she thought, she wouldn't have got a husband. But she got 3, she had a bit of a dowry as well, so that's all good. She was far from the kind rank of women. She was taught Latin, not because men wanted to seduce her, but because her father happened to be a tutor. But it's a definite instance of non-elite Latin tutelage. We can go further back, and this is one of my favourites actually. I want someone to do an article on her. So please do an article on Thomasina Percival, and she got to be martyrdly widow, and then she founded a grammar school in Week St Mary, which is a small village in Cornwall, as you do, where she was born. And she set it all up. It fell foul of the Reformation. She also set up a chantry, but it seems it was a very small village, so it had a very complicated set of catchments. They were very interested in whether anybody could, whether there was anyone to teach, basically. And it seems possible that although it's understood to be a preschool, it's quite likely that girls went to the way it was set up at a certain age. So the preschool is a more complex concept than we've been altogether thinking about. Finally, we have records from pupils about the women who taught them at Dane School, and my favourite is Richard Norwood, who Alison might know because he is one of the boys. He got a chance to play a girl, and he said that, even reflecting on it as a Quaker, he said that was the thing he enjoyed most in his life, and that's what he'd like to have done. But he did end up being a pirate and invented the diving bell instead. So I sadly lost the boy as a player. And he said that when his father went bust, the thing he really remembers about his education is going in long coats to school to my Dame Langton, learning my psalter, after which I was somewhat well entered. I learned, after he kind of got the hang of the psalm, I learned with great facility and delight, and was much affected with sundry of the psalms, especially those where God is praised with much emphasis and affection. I then had some general desire to do grace and faith of God, but before we knew it, it was acted in place. So I'm sorry about that. Lost to God, but later, thank goodness, quite enslaved. So what I want to say is, between the Psalms and the Catechism, women were educated by women, and women were involved in organising the delicate balance within the subject that would enable them to be both obedient adequately to one system and, on the other hand, able to be affectionate, love God, and their husband, according to the companionate system. And women's moral education was there, in a sense, to resolve this contradiction that we see played out in the comedies without crisis. To educate a good wife is to cause the balance of the household to work well and for her to not create the crisis. On the other hand, what theatre audiences enjoyed, as we see again and again in Shakespeare's plays, is seeing that interaction played out as crisis. Obedience, oh, hell to choose love by another's eyes, am I just a mouthy still? Again and again, the question of what a woman is after she's married and the crisis that is provoked between obedience and the companionate marriage is what they enjoy watching, what they enjoy thinking with. So we have these two zones of education, and I think that if you look at them together, you know a bit more about each of them than if you look at them separately. So I think the shrew needs to be offered to women's education, but conversely, I do think we know more about the shrew if we think about the other zones of education, in which there was a massive interest in not having the crisis, in shaping a female subject and using writing to do that. The other thing that this makes me feel about the unusual emphasis on obedience in the Tale of the Shrew is I had the opposite experience from Dimmer, because when I said I was writing on the Shrew, and a young actor said to me, "Oh, I love the Shrew, great part." And it's I can see that if you think about it. It has some good parts, but it's also part of the problematic nature of it. I think is that it's very satisfying for this reason, and this is to be over schematic, but I think it's very unusual in comedy in that it sponsors obedience and it uses obedience, the emphasis on obedience, to produce the resolution in companionate marriage. So the way it resolves the crisis between obedience and companionate marriage is a woman there to be told what to do or to discover that she loves the psalm. It resolves that by, very unusually, I think, by making one produce the other. She becomes obedient. At that point, she starts talking theologically, and it's a companionate marriage. And I felt that I got textual support there from the text itself. Thank you, text. Because Petruchio says at a certain point, when Hortensio and Lucentio wonder what Kate's obedience bodes, their exemplar, Petruchio, explains, marry peace, it bodes love and quiet life, an awful rule and right supremacy, and to be short, what not that's sweet and happy. Putting them together, making one produce the other. And I think the fact that Kate and Petruchio alone as a couple are fed at the end is, if you like, not necessarily external confirmation that that's the case, but part of the play's arc that it does this. It makes obedience produce the companionate marriage. If you think about the other comedies, they won't do that. They refuse obedience very early, place it in parental control, and then work through a whole different accommodation of the marriage crisis. So I think it's very unusual in doing that. To return to the themes of learning in this way, the way the play plays out the exaction of obedience, there is also, I wish that every article I've read has allowed itself 5% obtaining a shrew, so this is my 5% obtaining of a shrew. And at the end, Sly says that he's been having a wonderful dream about shrews being made to be obedient, and he's going to go home and sort his wife out to be obedient to him because he's learned to do the dream. Sly is great. He says all the things going on in the play very, very firmly at different points, like I don't know who I am, maybe I'm someone else, and I'm going to do this. And so we have Lucentio who says that, and we have Hortensio who says it very, very explicitly at the end of the scene when he's on his own. So men learn through example and through picking up the person who's managed successfully to form the household. At the same time as insisting that identity be fixed, Shrew unfixed it. Throughout the play, there are signals to notice that things exist in different dimensions and that roles do shift, not just Bianca saying her own words. And Sly's dream at the opening is part of that. He is willing to accept the meaning of a gendered body, and the question of illusion is foregrounded by whatever you take that opening to be, induction, lost of the play, whatever. In terms of education then, Shrew is at its heart, I got the wrong distance now. Okay, a retelling. It's a version of the much retold story of the re-education of the Shrew, the remaking of the Frauen's Shrew as towards marriage. For all that tale 901 is potentially a distant source, as Cynthia Callahan's edition makes clear, for readers, theatregoers and performers, the various Shrew stories were live in culture. They were both repetitions and culturally specific. Much more significant than the ultimate source in 901 is the anonymous mid-16th century third-person ballad, reprinted in many editions, including Symphony, A Merry Jest of a Shrewd and Cursed Wife, which heavily foregrounds several performative aspects, but is also extremely insistent on obedience. So I miss Mrs. Bean's pupils. There you are, that's Mrs. Bean's pupils. I think you probably know this one. In this, a wife, unfortunately, it's necessary to cut up an old horse, to salt the skin, and to put the wife in the cellar, covered in the salted skin, and beat her with rods. This causes her to be much increased. So this is one of the ways in which the Shrew is circulating. Our Shrew is another way in which the Shrew is circulating. The Shrew is another way in which the Shrew is circulating. But it seems interesting to me that there are a lot of other texts that do it slightly differently. And if it is after Shrew, it seems to me also potentially relevant that there's a text with at least one critic female authors called Elizabeth Fall's Warning. Does anybody know it? It's a long ballad, and it begins as you would expect. My old wife hanged herself, as you may understand. Now I've got a young wife, I'll bring her to my hand. By my old wife, 'tis true, a house I did inherit. With my young wife, I had nothing but a devilish spirit. Her I'll curb and keep under, and lock her out of door, take away her meat and drink, and never love her more. I lived with this for a while, but it seems completely clear to me it's the Shrew story, including treating her like a horse, curbing her, taking away her clothes, starving her. Okay, it's the Shrew story. So we get a bit more of this, and he gives the clothes to his daughter. It's all kind of quite circumstanced. There might be an actual war case behind it. And then there's 7 more pages of ballad, but it's her answer. And in her answer, she says, well, you know, the marriage went badly wrong, so I went to be a housekeeper. So she details what she did to get away from him. And in the end, she takes him to court, and instead of being wrapped in a horse's skin, I don't know if it was a horse motif, I don't know how you would, I don't know what counts in the horse motif, but she gets to go on a horse to London with a man who says she isn't sleeping with, but somebody has to pay your cab fare. So she gets to London and she starts a new life and takes him to court. At least one critic thinks by a woman. I wouldn't want to call it. I might kind of try and dig into it. I'm definitely interested in it. But what I think is, it's interesting that this context also hasn't been offered to Shrew. That we could have this context in my hypertext edition alongside the other one as another version of the Shrew. And so I think my final point is probably that, as Elizabeth McQuaid, as Paula McQuaid said, I think that in certain ways, these texts have been hidden from us in plain sight. They knew they existed, they were reading them and using them in the schoolroom. I'm not quite sure where they got lost, and I'd be really interested to know if anybody has any views on whether they are helpful, or I hope you think they're helpful context for sure. But I'm not sure where we managed to dispose of them. And I'm not sure whether I would like to bring them back, and I think I can learn a lot from the literary criticism on shrew when I teach my course on women in love in the autumn, if I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. And I'll go straight on to the questions. If anyone here would like to ask a question, anything you find. Yes? Great. Fantastic.
It is, I guess you call it that.
How would you
Gosh. Do you mean responsible that it's responding to another poem?
Yes.
I don't know what it's responding to, would be the key difference. I think it's responding to the shrew story. But I don't know how, I don't think it's responding to telling of the or at. So how different would you say that makes it?
Yeah, in terms of the answer response,
thank you, that's really helpful. Go on.
Yeah. There's the medical response to this. Somebody would rally, a man responds.
Yeah.
Come with me. I wish that we were not bothered.
Yes.
I was wondering if my way.
That is a really, really helpful context. Is it okay if I define what you said helpful? Yeah, because I think so. I hadn't seen it. I hadn't seen it as a response to. Yeah, but also because I haven't, because it's obviously kind of doggerel, which is fine with me. But because it's in a different cultural precinct, I hadn't seen it. I've done that thing that people do with Whitney, hadn't seen it. Do you know, am I making sense? That's a really, really helpful comment, which gives it an additional literary. Yes, thank you. I'm finally getting there.
And can you explain what you mean by the response position? I don't know his term. Response position.
Yeah, answer term.
I didn't know there was a position of answer form. Thank you.
Yeah, may I respond to? I mean, this is a broadside ballad, and I just want to say that there are countless broadside ballads that are about shrewish wives. Number one, and number two, that are made up of two sections: the ballad where the husband speaks and the ballad where the wife, or vice versa. The wife often speaks first, and then the husband tames her or doesn't tame her, for that matter.
C'était une institution. J'ai 26 ans, mon vieux Cornell, we transferred Cornell, later formed to the dusty within tradition as the ironical answer to a poet's lyrical ecstasy.
I might ask a question, a mirror question. As I think of the situation you're looking at, I have in mind the way Lady Olivia has decided to curb and keep herself under to some extent. And it takes a figure like Cesario, who's, after all, a woman in disguise, to castigate her and to tell her off for lacking manners, because she actually receives her with a veil. And it's only that triggers the lifting of the veil, and from there on, falling in love with herself again and with him. That's
That's a completely different take on modesty because it's when she takes control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's taken that female figure in disguise to castigate her, control her, the things that would recognize that she wants, but also a moral guidance.
And it gets all mixed up with the erotic format. Yes, thank you. That is a really, really helpful cognate. Thank you very much.
Just a quick question for monument matrons.
It's like the authorship question.
Yeah, I just wanted to know who's the author of this.
Oh, that is the monument of matrons question, isn't it? This one is Dorcas Martin. And it's in all of its ways really excellent anthology. I mean, catechisms aren't like, but it's really interesting who wrote them.
Okay, so the anthology is
Dorcas Martin translated and stuck her in front, and Paula McQuaid has done. I can't remember the series it's in. She's done an anthology of catechisms.
That's what I wanted.
Or catechism.
Thank you so much for this. This is really fascinating.
Paul McQuaid's book is good, really good, really interesting.
I might have another question. Do we know anything about Anne Bacon's letters for her two sons? And whether the letters she wrote to Francis might have had an effect on the wife she married when she was only 14.
Gosh, I don't, but it sounds extremely likely.
When she would be indirectly offering moral guidance to that young lady.
Yeah.
And then when she married that old kind of
absolutely, and I think you also find it, I think it's kind of one of the things that happens in recipe books too, which is it's a way of inducting exogamy. If that makes any sense, you know, this is what we're talking about, the education, but it's also about reproducing the family in a stable. Right? Yeah, I don't know those. I should know them. But, yeah, another great point. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah. Sure.
As you spoke of catechism, I'm thinking about that scene and what you did about not saying in which hero and catechized. What's your name? Your name, hero, and all that. And she objects to being catechized. And is that because she's being spoken to by men? How would you contextualize that? Well, what is that exactly? What could be going on here with hero's resistance to being catechized?
I think it's just a bunch of them I don't know. It's fascinating. So you would resist being catechized. And she the scary thing. I would need to relook in that context.
Yeah, same to me. I had no idea about it.
It would be, you know, the obvious things are your sort of also inappropriate location, inappropriate behaviour. It won't. I mean, they've categorised tons by the guy, so it's not that it can't be just the guy. She knows it already. I would have thought that it is a complex situation to accuse the categorised, isn't it? Can I go back to it and look? Sure. That's not helpful, but.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Today. Kiawna BREWSTER, is a fifth-year PhD student in literary studies at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Her research includes 18th and 19th century British literature, Anglo-Italian relations, translation theory, and gender and women's studies, literary comparative studies. And she's currently working on her dissertation, tentatively titled British Women Translating Italy, 1715-1860. She lives in Berlin, Germany, where she's been writing and teaching remotely since 2020. I saw that she had published an article entitled Celestial Beauty and the Significance of Moon in Giacomo Leopardi's County in May 2014. And she's going to be talking on Lennox versus the Bond.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. So I am presenting a portion of my first dissertation chapter. So referring to Lennox's translation of Shakespeare's sources, and I'll be focusing a little bit more on Lennox's role as a Shakespearean critic, where much of my chapter goes into her work as translator. So I'll give a little bit of an example of her translation at the end. So in mid-18th century England, Charlotte Lennox was a literary superstar. Over the span of a 43-year writing career, she produced novels, plays, poems, criticism, and translation, and became an active voice within Samuel Johnson's literary circle. As her biographer Susan Carlyle notes, Lennox, quote, defies many commonly held beliefs about 18th century women writers, end quote. For outside of her status as an esteemed novelist, she also became a prominent interlocutor in the critical conversations within the literary marketplace. Despite this stardom, Lennox's role as a translator is still massively underexplored. This is surprising, considering that Lennox translated the same number of works that she wrote novels, elevating her reputation to that of an esteemed translator both at home and abroad. Moreover, the little critical attention that Lennox's translations have received has focused on only those from French. Her Italian work has never been explored, and that's what I intend to shed light on today. Her Italian translations are found within her groundbreaking work, Shakespeare Illustrated, published in 1753 and made up of 3 volumes that are composed of the translations of the Italian and French sources that inspired Shakespeare's plays, along with summaries of the plays and her own critical commentary. Even though her work has received a lack of critical attention over the centuries, Shakespeare Illustrated was immensely popular in its time and is a notable text for a number of reasons. As is well known, Lennox was the first English woman to have published a critical text taking on Shakespeare's work, therefore making her work crucial to our understanding of the history of Shakespearean scholarship and women's criticism. Secondly, not only did Lennox identify new sources behind Shakespeare's plays, she also translated some of these original texts into English for the very first time. Her Italian translations include works by Giovanni Boccaccio, Ludovico Ariosto, Giraldi Cinzio, and Matteo Bandello, all major writers of the Italian Renaissance. These translations, as well as her criticism, consistently challenge Shakespeare's characterization of women and his adaptations of the original sources, and the modifications she makes focus on rewriting representations of femininity at a time in which the cult of womanhood was predominant in social discourse. It is therefore my objective to shed some light on Lennox's identity as a translator and Shakespearean critic by exploring the ways in which she rewrites Italian women's stories for an English audience, and how the nuances of her translations both challenge and conform to 18th century ideologies of femininity and nationalism. Despite Shakespeare Illustrated falling into obscurity for nearly 2 centuries, Lennox's identity as a critic deserves more scholarly attention. History has buried the seminal text underneath her more well-known work as a novelist, yet Shakespeare Illustrated is what brought Lennox to achieve celebrity status at her time. A significant reason for this is that she was able to do something that other Shakespearean critics could not, which was call attention to his linguistic shortcomings, particularly his lack of knowledge of the Italian language. It is now known that Lennox employed Giuseppe Verezzi, an influential Italian figure in the London literary scene, to teach her Italian in exchange for English lessons. She acquired enough of the language in a few months to translate all 7 Italian stories that appear in Shakespeare Illustrated. As we will see in examining her critical commentary, Lennox uses her Italian knowledge to position her judgment not only above Shakespeare, but also that of contemporary male Shakespearean critics such as Thomas Reimer. Her position as a woman working to make a name for herself in criticism, a male-dominated genre, made it even more essential to distinguish her expertise. Even though she was deemed an inferior critic, a mere lady advancing on Shakespeare, her ability to read and translate from the original Italian gained her undeniable credibility. What sets Lennox apart from other critics was how overtly critical she was in her commentary on Shakespeare's adaptation of his sources. One of her primary complaints is linguistic. She argues Shakespeare often misread the original sources, an issue that stems from his ignorance of the Italian language. She claims, for instance, it is very much to be doubted whether or not he understood the Italian and French languages, since we find he made use of translation from both whom he borrowed as their authors. She also challenges his status as a genius by accusing him of lacking originality and bastardizing the mostly female characters he's drawing upon from his sources by stripping his heroines of the power, strength, and dignity that was visible in their original counterparts. This stance appears repeatedly through her work, some notable comments being, I think wherever Shakespeare has invented, he is greatly below the novelist, since the incidents he has added are neither necessary nor probable. The character of the heroine is more exalted in the original than the copy. And lastly, but this play is full of such absurdities, which might have been avoided had the characters as well as the action been the same with the novel. These are only a few of her comments. You can see why it's entertaining to read. While her criticism often states the problems as being with the characters more generally, it's in her translations that her protests against the mischaracterizations of women come to light. Taking on the bard in such a manner was a courageous risk, for even though commentators on Shakespeare's works were still debating his merit at the time she was writing, his status was quickly rising to be emblematic of English literature and national identity. As bardology grew, criticizing Shakespeare was akin to attacking British national culture at the moment it was trying to establish itself and consolidate its imperial policies. Essentially, an attack on Shakespeare was an attack on England. Moreover, in a time when literary judgment was believed to be a task only suitable for men, Lennox's unapologetic critical work was bound to stir up attention in the literary scene. While national adoration of Shakespeare's work prevailed and ultimately impacted Shakespeare Illustrated's longevity, not all of the initial attention that Lennox received was negative. In fact, she received a great deal of praise in the years following its publication. Carlyle is the first to call attention to the momentary stardom that Lennox acquired after its publication. She states that Lennox's work was thought not only to be responsible scholarship, but it was also praised for being entertaining, and that the monthly review found her combination of intelligent content and biting criticism amusing and entertaining. Her work also captured the eyes of various critics abroad, particularly in Germany, where it was better received than at home. Thus, with contemporary Shakespeare critics assessing Lennox's work and popular magazines such as the Gentleman's Magazine, deeming her work worthy of significant attention, Lennox had her moment. Even for a short period of time, as Carlyle notes, she made it intellectually acceptable to challenge the genius of a national hero. Let us turn to the translations themselves. Lennox translated 7 Italian novellas for Shakespeare Illustrated, and my chapter engages with the 3 stories which received the most notable changes. Today, I will engage with one of these stories, Boccaccio's 9th novel of the second day from the Decameron, which becomes Shakespeare's Cymbeline, as it is one of which Lennox is the most critical. Thematically, there are common threads that run across each of the 3 stories. All of the main heroines are seriously wronged by men, all are found to be innocent, and all ultimately receive justice for the acts committed against them. Lennox's translation method is subtle yet meaningful. It consists of producing a mostly faithful translation and choosing strategic moments to incorporate her modifications, all of which are consistent. They work to highlight the heroine's virtues, emphasize their intelligence, love, and devotion, and showcase the depth of their thoughts and the savviness of their strategies in seeking to attain their desires. It must be mentioned that she also makes modifications that are less aggressive. For example, she censors sexually explicit scenes, highlights libertinism in the anti-heroine figures, and reinforces Italian stereotypes in the original counterpart to the infamous Shakespearean villain Iago from Othello. In considering the nuances of her translation approach, it is important to recall the pressures placed upon women critics trying to make a name for themselves in a patriarchal literary market that emphasized the importance of virtuous domestic womanhood as vital to the integrity of the English nation. When confronting Shakespeare Illustrated, we must constantly remind ourselves of the text's subversive nature. In taking on not only the most idolized figure of English literature and culture, but also dominant male voices in the literary scene, Lennox does an artful job of treading the line between risk-taking and adhering to convention. In so doing, her text was able to achieve the widespread attention that it could not have otherwise drawn if she had taken a more radical stance against the predominant ideologies of the time. Therefore, I aim to demonstrate how we can find meaning and impact even in the subtleties of Lennox's translation, and how she managed to find ways to make her women defy the limitations previously placed upon them. In her translation of Boccaccio's 9th novel of the second day from Decameron, the source story for Shakespeare's Cymbeline, we encounter a new style of intervention in which Lennox takes more liberty in adding and removing content from the original tale. Her changes all work towards the same objective of enhancing the heroine's characterization. The novella recounts an unfortunate bet that an Italian merchant, Bernabo, makes with another merchant, Ambroduolo. It begins when Bernabo overhears Ambroduolo stating that all women are unfaithful and incapable of resisting their desires. Bernabo, believing his own wife, Ginevra, to be loyal and virtuous, challenges Ambroduolo to try and tempt her into committing an act of infidelity. When Ambroduolo finds a way to cheat and deceive Bernabo in order to make him believe he succeeded, the poor merchant loses his money and orders his wife to be killed. Ginevra escapes, disguises herself as a man, and begins to serve the Sultan. One day, she comes across Ambroduolo and leaves him to confess his devious act, thus condemning him to death and allowing her to return to her husband, where they live the rest of their lives in riches. If we focus on Ginevra, the story reflects upon the wit and virtue of a woman who is capable of overcoming the patriarchal hierarchy that forces her into such an unfortunate Boccaccio's version, her purpose remains that of a dutiful wife, and her story exists as a subplot in relation to the triumph of her husband. Despite her being the heroine of the tale and using her dexterity to trick Agudjuolo into confessing his wrongdoing, she is still overshadowed by her male counterpart. Lennox therefore sets out to increase her visibility and the reader's consideration of her success. First, considering her critical commentary on how Shakespeare transforms the short story into his play Cymbeline, Lennox certainly does not begin her criticism with praise. She states, he copied all those circumstances from Boccaccio that were necessary to serve his design, but he has entirely changed the theme, the characters, and the manners, and that he has done so greatly for the worse is, I think, easy to prove. Where we find her criticism to align with her modifications in her translation is yet again in Shakespeare's treatment of the character and manner of the heroine of the play, in his version named Imogen. The first, most obvious change deals with her social status. Shakespeare has transformed the figure of a merchant's wife to a great princess, who marries the low-born posthumous, who becomes Bernaboe in the original, against her father's will. This shift changes the progression and ultimate triumph of the original Ginevra, who gains riches and a respected reputation as a result of her autonomous, courageous acts. Instead, Imogen is reunited with Posthumus, forgiven by her father, in return of her royal privilege. According to Lennox, Shakespeare weakens the nature of his heroine. Given the chance to assert her positional power and requite the cruel accusations against her by leaving Posthumus and returning directly to the throne, she is overtaken by feminine sensibility. Lennox states that this drastic departure from Boccaccio's original plotline renders these incidents, quote, absurd, unnatural, and improbable, unquote, making the overall sequence of events ridiculous to the last degree. She constantly takes issue with the blatant disregard for the reputation of the female characters across Shakespeare's renditions. As Margaret Duby writes, quote, he tends too often, in her opinion, to diminish women into lusty weaknesses or neurotic weaklings, taking from them the power and moral independence which the old romances had given them. His misreading of the stories means he tends to humiliate women, end quote. While I agree with Duby's contention, I would be hesitant to claim that Lennox entirely approved of the women's representation in the original tale. The following modifications will prove that she was indeed not defending Boccaccio's version. As Lennox did not find what she wanted as a reader in neither Shakespeare nor Boccaccio's version, she set out to create a version of her own that achieved a high level of fidelity to the original Italian, with only a slight shift in focus. With the knowledge of the critics and the readers of her time, Lennox produced an accurate translation of Boccaccio's tale, when in fact her subtle changes actively work against the hegemonic focus on the masculine and towards a new vision of the feminine. For the very first time, the courageous heroine is able to be seen as more than just a victim of Agudjuolo's machination. Now, I'd like to give at least one example of Lennox's translation during my time, so as to go beyond the criticism and see how it plays out in her translative technique. The first moment to be taken into consideration is when Bernaboe is trying to convince Agudjuolo of his wife's fidelity to defend her against the claims that all women succumb to their desires. I've translated this passage from the Italian of the original text as follows, on the left-hand side. I am a merchant and not a philosopher, and I will give you a merchant's answer. I acknowledge that what you say can happen to foolish women who have no shame at all. But there are those who are wise and are so solicitous for their honor that they become stronger than men who do not care to look after their own. And this is what my wife is made of. Lennox's translation is notably longer, as she takes the liberty to include her own additions to the passage. She writes, I am a merchant and not a philosopher. Therefore, I will not pretend to reason with you. But this I must say, that those women who are unchaste are so because they have no sense of shame and are indifferent about the world's opinion. But women who are wise and virtuous are so solicitous to preserve their honor that they become stronger than men, who take no care to restrain their irregular appetites. And my wife is of the number of those women who are watchful over their appetites and solicitous to preserve their honor. Generally, her translation contains a stronger focus on the perception of the female figure, and she highlights the feminine features that are most treasured in the 18th century. In the original text, Boccaccio uses the word honor once to depict the idea of a pure and chaste woman. In Lennox's translation, there's a repetition of these empowering words such as wise, virtuous, and honor, therefore shifting the focus towards a stronger depiction of admirable feminine qualities. In the original, the comparison between female modesty and the lack of solicitude is subtle and brief. In Lennox's translation, her language regarding the comparison is much more compelling, and she refers to the honorable woman as stronger than the man, exemplifying her fortifying respectability. Lennox is also more critical towards the male figure. Instead of simply stating that he has no such solicitude, she further states they have no care to restrain their irregular appetite. We also see at the end of the passage that Lennox elongates Bernabo's reference to his own wife and reiterates her innate sense of virtue through highlighting her capability of watching over her appetite. And she ends the passage with the repetition of the key phrase describing Ginevra as a woman who is solicitous to preserve her honor. Through modifying the language of this telling moment of the story, Lennox successfully shifts the focus away from Bernabo and Ambrogio and characterizes the female figure, thus giving Ginevra a sense of identity outside of her domestic role. It's also interesting that Lennox decided to translate the initial words of Bernabo in a way that demeans the character of Ambrogio. As she writes, "I will not pretend to reason with you, instead of simply I give the merchant's answer." This suggests a preference to give Bernabo a sense of moral superiority over Ambrogio, therefore placing the character who praises the figure of the strong woman above those who demean women for sexualizing them. Lennox both expands on one of the most telling speeches in the short story on the defense of women and ennobles the language through rewriting a section to further idolize the figure of the virtuous woman. The fact that Lennox chose to elaborate on this specific passage gives a compelling message. She puts the praise of a woman in the mouth of the male protagonist of the story, as he's insulting masculine behavior in a way that strengthens the conception of the honor and ethics of women. Lennox's modifications bring the reader's focus to the importance of female agency in a patriarchal society, thus eloquently fitting within 18th century ideologies of femininity in Britain. I wish I had time to dive into the rest of Lennox's translations, as they really are fascinating and reveal much to us about her identity as a translator and Shakespearean critic. However, if there's one message I'd like to leave behind, it's that Shakespeare Illustrated does deserve more scholarly attention, not only to understand the work as an essential component of the history of women criticism, but as a complex cultural study. Mary Wisner-Hicks states language is so powerful that it determines, rather than simply describes, our understanding of the world. Knowledge is passed down through language, and language is power. Shakespeare Illustrated demonstrates precisely how language is at the core of Lennox's craft, and her attention to it exceeds that of her contemporaries. Oscillating between languages, traditions, genres, and forms, her lexical decisions as a translator and critic have the power to construct her readers' understanding of not only Shakespeare's authorial moods, but also the world of Italian literature and those who inhabit it. Thank you.
Thank you, that was fascinating. You made me discover a whole new world. Would you like to ask any questions? I'll open it up. Yes.
Hi. One. I just have a question for translation. And the letter translation.
I don't have that now at the moment, but if during the break I can pull up the original Italian in my chapter if you would like. We can talk about that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was, I think, that same passage in which you showed us your literal translation and Lennox's translation. At some point, do I get you right when you the point you made about, is this an positive or restrictive relative clause? Is that what you wanted to highlight? That is, say, stronger than men who do not care. That's a restrictive one. So part of men do care, as opposed to men who take no care to restrain. So all men take no care. Is this a thing, or is it just that the comment placed there? Does the comma after men, which was before the relative clause,
have that meaning of men in general take no care to restrain their appetite, as opposed to some men do not care to look after their appetite. Or is it inconsistent punctuation?
It could be. I think I'm a little confused by 18th century punctuation and placements of that, to be honest. But I would take it as more generally, as you mentioned.
But even in the original, or with the original, would have been a restriction. There is a subgroup of men who do not take care, and these can be compared.
The question is about the Italian narrative, right?
Or in the translation, if Lennox may be trying to make a more general point about men in general than the Italian, in which the comparison might have been more limited, and opposing two categories of men, those who are careful enough to look after their own, as opposed to those who aren't, whereas in the English, it would be men in general,
Right.
who are prey to their appetite.
That's fascinating. I'm going to go back and think a little bit more about that. I think I've been focusing so much on the female figure, but yes, I hadn't thought so much about how the punctuation was from there for the translation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is very interesting.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk, for also coming to the conclusion that Lennox is certainly critical of Shakespeare, but is certainly not defending Boccaccio. Thank you, very important for illustrating that. Now, one of the things that I'm thinking here is that in the two translations, I see in some of the additions that she's making some of the usual phrases and the usual, tropes, basically, of certain defenses of women. And do you have any idea of what her sort of bibliographical, what kind of works she's looking at to do that? Do you know of any of the defenses that she was maybe looking at to pump up the volume on her version? I'll be honest, I don't feel that this translation exercise necessarily convinces me that she has given the actual characters of Boccaccio more, how should we say, independent and whatever. But what I do see is that Lennox is deeply involved in those defenses.
Yeah, so there's a couple of footnotes in my chapter directly about this, about kind of if it's also restricted, to focus on virtue, which has been sort of a quality that has tended to, feed into the idea of the domestic woman in the 18th century, and thinking about, the repetition of sort of the characterization of women as virtuous, which she does very often. I read more into sort of she's translating and changing what the original Italian, sort of the word virtue held more significance towards chastity, like a chaste and domesticated woman, where I like to think of Lennox's usage of virtuous towards focusing more on the women's resilience, wit, and sort of translating the term virtue in a sense, if that makes sense, for her time period. So creating a new meaning behind these literary tropes, but also adhering to them, because there were limits placed upon her as a woman writing as a critic, and the translator of this time, that she couldn't necessarily go too far outside the box.
The glossary of terms from the 18th century, wit or virtue, which isn't just chastity. She's getting that from where?
I'm not exactly sure where she's getting the terminology
from culture in general.
I think from sort of language around women in the 18th century, virtue is a really loaded term. And so we see virtue coming up very frequently in her work as a novelist. So we find also her tendency to really emphasize a woman's virtue in her translations is particularly significant to her identity as an author, and the way that she utilizes the word virtue and sort of provides it with a new meaning.
not just Shakespeare, but also, so that's interesting. Her work as a novelist being incorporated into. Thank you so much.
The passage that struck me, the line that struck me was women who are indifferent about the world's opinion who are shameless. I kind of like, go those women. That doesn't quite comport with the paradigm of the virtuous woman. That seems like a transgressive moment. Is that an appropriate reading?
I think so. I think Lennox's text is full of instructions. Sort of my chapter really doesn't try to argue for her being completely feminist. I think that there's a lot of sort of, there's a different approach that she was taking that was, like I said at the very beginning, transgressive, progressive, but also in a way very traditional for her time as well. So she's adhering to convention while also challenging convention. And there's that tension consistently throughout all of her translations.
Because it seems like it's those are the women who are I'm rooting for in the passage.
Right.
Thank you. I am totally ignorant about Charlotte Lennox, but I did look up, it was apparently she was referred to also as the author of the female Aristotle. I was wondering if she herself was not a figure of a Aristotle. If you give me back what you're saying about trying to reestablish some kind of agency.
Yes, yeah, I would like to think that as well. Yeah, she's essentially claiming once again, these terms and providing new meanings for, a woman's role at the time that she's writing. And she is helping us challenge those sort of ideas while, staying within her own.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. I would like to know if Lennox ever theorizes her translation. Because you told us that she was, criticizing Shakespeare for changing his sources, for misunderstanding, mistranslating. So does she have a translation theory, or
I wish. I really wish. I looked through all of her criticisms in order for her, any translation note or something that would resemble a translator's note or reflection on the way that she translates. But unfortunately, there's really none of that. We only know, from the biographical information that we have, that she has employed an Italian author, writer, and influential person in the literary scene to help learn Italian for the purpose of translating. But there's not much information on her identity as a translator outside of this. But despite that, she was very popular at translating at the time many texts that I have not looked into personally, but her identity as a translator was predominant, and it sort of fell, into the 19th century. She kind of went into obscurity and became more known for the female fiction texts. Very much.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I don't have to, but no, just thank you very much for this paper that shows the, the forms of continuity between Shakespeare's time and Charlotte Lennox's, and this idea that lots of us as early modernists work on women's translation as one space of textual empowerment, and because women could not publish, their own work, but you're showing how this survives even at a time when she is, publishing her own fiction, etc. So I thought that was really interesting to see how it goes on into the next century and how that's really, so that was really interesting. I was also wondering the line you picked up on, Dipna, I was wondering if her gloss on the opinion, to a certain extent, in the end, could also be read as somewhat diminishing slightly the idea of shame and unchastity.
Yeah.
So
they don't care. The women who don't care, to be applauded in that passage.
No, definitely it's negative. Those women don't care, but at the same time, doesn't it take something away from the gravity of
Exactly. It's good that they don't care.
Yes.
It's that they're above them. That gloss is different to the world's opinion.
Yeah.
you know, which one of the virtues attributed to men in that period, that they have this kind of self-integrity, I think.
Right, and
You know, virtues is this self-contained,
right.
you know, masculine quality.
So yeah, yeah. Thank you for providing some view.
Sorry,
to
I
think
just-
about these quotes.
yeah.
It's really nice. Yeah, I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
There's something quite odd in having described as responsible and entertaining. So I expect them to go with educational and entertaining. And being educational can transform and become responsible. Which again, striking in itself as a variation of the use of what is for. Yes, all right. Yeah. So thank you very much. Quite a discourse. Yes, Dr. Murat OGUTCU, an associate professor who received his PhD degree with his dissertation entitled Shakespeare's Satirical Representation of the Elizabethan Court and the Nobility in English History Plays from the Department of English Language and Literature at Société University, Turkey, 2016. From August 2012 to 2013, he was a visiting scholar at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He has been a head of the Department of Western Languages and Literature at Murat University, Turkey, from 2016 onwards. He is the general editor of the Turkish Shakespeares project that aims to introduce texts, productions, and research on Turkish Shakespeares to a broad international audience of students, teachers, and researchers. He's also a researcher at the AHRC funded project Medieval and Early Modern Orients that aims to contribute to our understanding of the medieval and early modern encounters between England and the Islamic worlds. He has written book chapters and articles on his research interests that include early modern studies, Shakespeare, and cultural studies. Amongst his most recent essays, I recently quote Masculine Sight, Masculine Dreams, Henry V, and Jacobean Politics of Court Performance.
It's a great pleasure to talk in this year's Congress about the topics of performing gender in Turkish Shakespeares. Turkey has a long tradition of reading, translating, and staging the Shakespeare's plays as part of the country's westernization process. In the early years of the Turkish Republic, the theaters among main artistic forms were seen as a means to naturalize the progressive evolution of the Republic to avoid a wider audience, which manifested itself in the most essential legal introduction of female Turkish and Muslim performance on the stage. The theatre became thereby a forum for exhibiting and teaching Western and progressive forms of egalitarian gender relations that guaranteed equal opportunities. Therefore, this paper will illustrate how the gendered body of female performance became a site for affirming the positive discrimination of the Republic's progressive policies for women to break the socio-cultural glass ceiling to encourage women off the stage and to have a place in the work and the public life in Turkey. Through law, it should be noted that this presentation makes use of only a representative list of the female performance to give a glimpse about the relationship of Shakespeare and gender relations in Turkey. In order to understand the achievements of the Republic, we need to have a look at the Ottoman Congress, which preceded and which we should consider sometimes as a historical root of the problems and sometimes of innovations regarding the representation of women and Shakespeare on the Turkish stage. We know that the first Ottoman performances of Shakespeare in Turkey were done by Ottoman Armenian and Ottoman Greek theatre companies, which performed Shakespeare in Armenian and Greek respectively in the early 19th century. Following the success of Ottoman Armenian and Greek companies, original Turkish works inspired by Shakespearean themes and conventions became influential in the practice of both Turkish drama and Shakespeare's plays in Turkey. This was also paralleled with the increasing number of Turkish translations of Shakespeare that was the result of the establishment of Office of Translators as an extension of the Ottoman Empire's westernization efforts. The first translation of Shakespeare into Turkish were either retranslations from other languages, notably French, or from other genres like opera versions, or from Charles Lamb's family-friendly version. With the advent of the Ottoman Theatre Company, also called the Gezi Paşa Company, founded by Lisak in 1868, Romeo and Juliet became the first play performed in Turkish, which gradually centralized the position of Shakespeare in Turkish theatres. Lisakov's company introduced many important performances of Shakespeare, the most notably of whom is possibly Vero Cantagia, or better known as Siranush, who started her career when she was only 15 years old in 1827. She was also important because after performances as Ophelia, she became the first female Hamlet in Ottoman Turkey in 1901, and was highly praised for her acting styles. While non-Muslim women experienced a relative freedom on the stage because of Sharia rules that forbade the presence of non-related men and the presence of women, Muslim women were not allowed to perform in plays. The Istanbul City Theatre's attempts in 1980 to train Muslim actresses like Afife Jade to perform for only female audiences were cut short when the same was not allowed to perform in the public, for which she resigned from the city. Using the non-Muslim pseudonym Jale, she became Afife Jade clandestinely, and she performed in a clandestine way in plays, but was regularly persecuted by contemporary police forces who stormed performances and cut them short, from which she escaped through the help of fellow actors or actresses. From 1920 to at least 1924, constant surveillance and the fear to be imprisoned posed her severe headaches, which were mistreated with contemporary medical issues like true morphine, and caused her to spend excessive time in mental asylums, which prevented her from further pursuing her acting career. Despite the fact that gender discrimination was still felt in the early years of the Republic, with the founding father, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's personal insistence, female performers were legally allowed to perform on the public stage. When Atatürk watched a play in Izmir in July 1923, he asked that the female role should be performed by Turkish women, upon which Bediye Muvahhid, who was the first Muslim silver screen actress in Turkey, volunteered while being an audience member at the same play. After continuing to act in subsequent plays in Izmir, Bediye Muvahhid officially started her theatre career by performing Desdemona in Shakespeare's Othello in December 1923, which was directed by famous Muhsin Ertuğrul, who popularized Shakespeare through his efforts in the city and state theatres. As part of the Greco-Turkish peace in the early years of the Republic, Bediye Muvahhid performed the same role in Greek, the Greek delegate that arrived in Turkey in 1930. This was followed by the performing in Othello productions, which was performed by Turkish and Greek performers in Greece in 1931 as part of diplomatic relations. Among many other plays, she performed in several Shakespeare productions such as Hamlet, Twelfth Night, and Merchant of Venice. She continued her acting career in the Istanbul City Theatre until her retirement in 1975 and translated several plays into Turkish and illustrated one of the earliest instances on how the Republic valued the presence of women in public life and how Shakespeare was instrumentalized in domestic and international politics by the Turkish Republic. Bediye Muvahhid paved the way for several generations of female performers who had a close relationship with Shakespeare's plays. While her contemporaries like Jahide Songbu, who impersonated Desdemona and Othello in the 1930s, turned to the cinema, and Ney Renier co-starred alongside Muvahhid and the White House in that group, lost her life at a very young age. Other female performers were soon to follow. One of the most prominent of the subsequent generation actresses was Yıldız Kenter, who became one of the greatest performers and educators of drama in Turkey. Being the daughter of a diplomat and an Englishwoman, having studied drama in the West and being an educator of drama throughout her career, Yıldız Kenter coupled her bilingual and theatrical skills in her very successful career. Having formed the Kenterler Theatre together with her brother Murat Kenter and her husband Şükran Güngör, Yıldız Kenter has performed many award-winning plays and taught a great majority of contemporary Turkish performers. But her career as performer did not start in a smooth way, especially because men felt the need to explain how women should perform Shakespeare. Here is a part of Lütfi Ay's unfair review of her performance of Olivia in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night in 1958. Yıldız Kenter could not express the sadness that Olivia was buried in. She almost gave the impression of a hysterical woman who would ache while the high horseman locked her in her room, and therefore, despite her beautiful looks, Yıldız Kenter could not portray the role with the grace it required. Trying to mansplain how Olivia should be performed lays bare how, despite the many advancements in the place of women in Turkey, especially through the theaters, especially after the foundation of the Republic. Spokespersons of fragile masculinity try to minimize female intellect and female presence. Yet a letter written by Yıldız Kenter's mother might indicate why Kenter continued with her acting career despite the negative comments that followed her first performance. Yıldız, you are the apple of my eye, my daughter. Today is a blessed day that you took your first step in your career. I say it fast because to start an acting career as a lead role in a beautiful work, a genius like Shakespeare, has been the luck of you people. But let this beginning not make you proud, and contrary, let it connect you to more work and constant humility. Actually, I expect this from your honest and strong character. I wish with all my heart that today will be a happy day in your life. I wish you success, health, and happiness from God, my champion. The founding principles of the Turkish Republic for egalitarian gender relations and her mother's support, despite the overwhelming power of attractive forces, has strengthened Yıldız Kenter's determination to continue her career, performing several other productions of Shakespeare, like a well-received performance in Hamlet in 1959, and teach many future performers and directors in Turkey. Among the actresses after Yıldız Kenter's generation, Ayla Algan is another important actress whose fortunes have been based on how the Republic supported immigrants. Being the daughter of an immigrant from Crete, her merchant father, along with his and her artist mother's support, Ayla Algan's acting career also was supported by her late husband, with whom she studied at the New York Actors Studios Repertory Theater of Broadway until 1961. Becoming one of several Turkish female talents, Ayla Algan's performance of Hamlet and Ophelia in the 1961 and 1965 seasons in Istanbul City Theater's productions of Shakespeare's Hamlet were much acclaimed. Following Muhsin Ertuğrul's resignation from Istanbul City Theater, Algan also resigned and founded the Language and Culture Center, where several important visual performers and directors were trained. While her acting career continued in the theaters, both in Turkey and abroad, France, Germany, and other countries, Algan also performed films and also took active part in the music industry as a singer and composer, especially in the 1970s. Formally retiring from the Istanbul City Theater in 1999, Algan still continues performing in theaters and also in TV series and movies. Though, of course, heavily based on her own diligence, Algan's acting career illustrates how the Republic enabled her to express herself freely and in a versatile way. It also shows how Muhsin Ertuğrul and his vision of a versatile Shakespeare styles enabled Algan to express herself beyond gender restrictions by starting her professional acting career by both performing Ophelia and Hamlet in 1961. Some illustrative examples of Algan's contemporaries and subsequent important female performances of Shakespeare's plays in Turkey are as follows. Edward Güvenç, for instance, is still considered as among the most acclaimed Lady Macbeths in Turkey with her 1962 performance, who also performed in Meşhur Dağlar in 1964 and in The Winter's Tale in 1973. Another important figure is Ayten Gökçe, who started her acting career in 1958 in the state theaters and had a very successful performance career of performing Olivia in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night in 1963. Işık Yenersu's performance of Catherine in the avant-garde production of The King of the Shoe aroused much interest in the Turkish audience. Sumri Avucı's 1992 performance of Lady Macbeth took that performance one step further through her very daring performance scenes, having Lady Macbeth trying to clean herself, for instance, in a bath. Also, Zerrin Tekinder's performance of Cleopatra in the 2012 local has been praised by critics and audiences alike. But I want to turn your attention to one of the most acclaimed female candidates of Turkey, namely Fatma Girik, whom we lost unfortunately this year. In Metin Aksan's Kadın Hanım, that is female candidates, Girik performs in a surreal adaptation that uses and plays upon many conventions of Turkish cinema and theater, like the rural film genre. Excellence, almost psychedelic rendition, coupled with the energy of Upland's acting, made the film an important milestone for Shakespeare. Focusing on intergenerational power struggles within the upper class members of the Bruce case, Yerik's rendition of Hamlet represents the new Turkish woman, who is educated, beautiful, clever, and compassionate, and whose concerns is not just to survive, but to live in unrule in Turkey. This is set against Gertrude, who is the old woman type, as a self-centric wife who survives and makes the most of her life through her expenditures. She earns only with her physical beauty in the male-dominated Turkish society. In the movie, Yerik's Hamlet as a dominant rather than reluctant against not just gender but also gender stereotypes. The performance illustrates how the gender bubble of the Turkish female Hamlet becomes a material and metaphorical space to depict the struggle of women to maintain and survive in power structures. Yerik's strong performance against patriarchal forces sheds light onto resisting flawed gender relations in the 1970s of Turkey and beyond. Now I want to turn to a relatively younger performer who could be considered to continue Yerik's passion. Demet Evgar started her career as an amateur performer in her hometown Manisa. She graduated from the State Conservatory of Istanbul University, and during her studies, she formed, along with friends, the Theatre Culture Company. While she continued to work with this group, she also performed at the Temporary Theatre Group until 2009, which has proved a very formative period until the further separation of Yıldız Kent. Moving to Congress Theatre Company, Demet Evgar's performances at the 2012 Macbeth and 2014 My Food King Lear productions, Evgar has, along with her fellow actors, brought new life to Shakespeare performances in Turkey. For instance, along with other prominent performers, Evgar's performance of multiple roles in the adaptation of King Lear, where Lear retells Lear's stories to other fellow actors, is marked by a dreamlike grotesque performance that foregrounds human qualities. Complicating notions of the puppets and the puppeteers, the performance underscores how social demarcations are actually void and non-existent in crisis situations. The possibility of Demet Evgar's rise into a successful performer is a direct consequence of the general spirit of the Turkish Republic made by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who conceptualized it as an institution that is there for those who have nobody, and aim to have egalitarian social opportunities regardless of one's origin and socioeconomic background. The Republic has especially enabled women to express themselves in public life to the dismay of the ongoing patriarchal restrictions. But Shakespeare is not just an urban elite entertainment for the relatively well-to-do women in Turkey, but also through rural theatre companies is used to emancipate rural women. For instance, the documentary about the performance process of staging King Lear as credited not only shows how Shakespeare's plays can be domesticated, but also shows how they can be democratized. Being an all-female and rural traveling theatre, the performance of the Arslanköy Theatre Company gives new insights to what extent Shakespeare might be considered universal. Directed by Tim Nesmer, the documentary tells the story of Fatma Fatih as Lear, Behiye Yanık as Cordelia, Cennet Güneş as Goneril, Zeynep Fatih as Bregan, and with a substitute player in the performance. The backstories of both the rural and performers and the rural audiences prior and following the recorded performance of Shakespeare's play create a retrospective vision, and they comment upon patriarchal restrictions and illustrate how the theatre, though very painfully, can be used to overcome these and give a chance for rural women to express themselves and have an active role in public life. Thus, Shakespeare in Turkey is not just used by and for urban audiences, but also by rural ones as a means to ease and enhance gender relations. Conclude. With the advent and gradual progressive policies of the Turkish Republic, women have been able to express themselves freely while performing Shakespeare on the Turkish stage. Women have performed Shakespearean roles either as female characters or major male characters in gender-like productions. But of course, there is a need for documentation for the recognition of the impact of Shakespeare for positive gender politics in Turkey, which my project, Turkish Shakespeares, aims to. Introducing text productions and research on Turkish Shakespeare to a broader international audience, students, teachers, and researchers. We publish every 2 weeks new blog entries. Through short descriptions and links to productions and adaptations, and compiling a bibliography with hyperlinks of secondary works on Shakespeare in Turkey, we intend to illustrate how Turkish Shakespeares and the socio-political history of Turkey have affected each other. So please subscribe to our project. I hope that this very short presentation on how gender politics were positively affected by progressive policies of the Turkish Republic that instrumentalized Shakespeare has been as meaningful to me and to you as it is for me. Thank you very much.
Je peux poser des questions en direct. Murat, thank you very much for the talk. It's a new format. It's Zoom live. It was fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind comments.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Murat, for this
You're welcome.
very interesting and complete history. And I was wondering, and I don't know if you can answer this, but would you say that the progressive aspects and aesthetics that you've been describing over the years have continued despite what's going on right now in Turkey?
Actually, there have been many ups and downs in Turkish history, which is not just related with the past 20 years, but it has a long history because I guess when Europe had its Renaissance or early modern period, we had more like we had ended that Renaissance, and that's why we have a different time scheme of events. But I would say that theater, when whether it was oppressed or repressed, like in the 1980s and by the coup d'etat, still found some way to express itself. And I guess being also very much into how satire works, I think that that literature actually works in more crisis situations. If everything is fine, then I guess it's quite easier to do literature, because if you have restrictions, whether they are imposed by others or whether it's just a kind of censorship, then you are forced to create more artistic works, I guess. And that's why I guess I would say that contemporary Turkey is actually has more opportunities to express themselves through drama than, let's say, earlier periods, possibly. But of course, artistic freedom is also an important issue. But apart from that, rather than restrictions posed through some legal means, there is a kind of lack of support for theaters in general, or the entertainment industry, which is somehow harming.
Thank you very much for this.
You're welcome.
Beautiful presentation. I confess my ignorance about the Turkish theatrical scene, so I have very basic questions. So one basic question is is the range of this theater, this type of theater adapting Shakespeare outside just Istanbul? Are the theatrical phenomena that you're describing, is it primarily the theatrical life of Istanbul, or have these ladies been able to perform elsewhere? Did they go on tour? How large and how geographically spread is the theatrical phenomenon? And another perhaps related question to this one is the degree of involvement of public funding for this type of theatrical activity, whether these are whether these have been historically or at different times different combinations of private investing, private theatrical companies or private theaters, or whether this is mostly state-supported Shakespeare that we have.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very interesting question. Generally speaking, there is, of course, a kind of duality of theaters in Turkey. On the one hand side, we have private theaters who are centered in Istanbul. There are hundreds of theaters. I just cannot recount them one by one, but at least there are some 30 or 40 which are very acclaimed and which also are able to, let's say, sustain their business despite, let's say, the pandemic especially. But apart from that, there are state theaters that have been founded, I guess, in the 1930s. And since the 1930s, the state theaters first started in Istanbul and Ankara, and then they spread throughout time, like in the 1960s, and then again in the 1990s. And there are, I guess, now some 30 state theater stages throughout Europe, throughout Turkey, from each regions. And these theaters are funded by the state, and their prices are, the ticket prices especially, they are comparatively lower than the private theaters. But the Istanbul theaters, who are private theaters, they although their prices are relatively higher than the state theaters, there is still a kind of, and they have a good kind of audience who still follows them. And but generally speaking, we can say that much of the both as the audience numbers and the theater goers, and also how much money is made through theater, is usually centered in Istanbul and Ankara, and usually considered to be a kind of urban entertainment. But of course, there are private theaters also in other regions, like, let's say, for instance, in Gaziantep, in Trabzon, in Konya. There in many cities there are private theaters, but their budget is usually low. And even if they produce a Shakespeare play, there is also they are also having a lack of means to promote their work, which I try to figure out through sometimes investigating them and listing them, and also through the project. I just want them to be heard. As for funding generally, again, the public theaters, as I've stated, are funded by the state, and the private theaters, they also get some funding, but starting with, I guess, 2007, that funding has been usually restrained, and most of the theater companies who got funding earlier than that date did not receive any funding, and usually they would even promote this. We are doing theaters despite not having any fundings and the like. And the pandemic has been very harmful for theaters in Turkey in general, because most of them had to be closed down in the early phases. And since most of the theaters in Turkey, private theaters and the state theaters, I mean, did not have a kind of any digital means, or they had digital means, but they would not use those digital means earlier, like streaming services. It took some time until most of these used them, and now they are overcoming some of the harms they got through the pandemic, and unfortunately through the contemporary economic recession by and by. But everything will be fine, hopefully.
Thank you so much for this. I was lucky enough to see a performance of Macbeth at the Atatürk Cultural Center in Istanbul before it was shut down. And I just wanted to know, is there any particular play that's particularly performed, and if in Turkey, loved, performed, and if you have any reasons for why that might be the case?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your wonderful question. So as for the first, for the Atatürk Culture Center, it has been reopened. So hopefully we invite you to it. And for the second part of your question, historically speaking, Othello has been somehow very popular, especially until the 1980s, I guess. Because the first performances were by, let's say, apart from Romeo and Juliet, of course, they were about Othello, and even the Sultan, Abdulhamid II, he was also very fond of course, an abridged version of Othello, and which brought tears into his eyes, as it has been recorded by some contemporary sources. And also there were other prominent figures who made Othello very prominent in Turkey, like a traveling performer called Otello Kamil, because he performed Othello in rural parts of Turkey in a slightly comic version. And through him, and also through, I guess, the domestic issues especially, Othello became very, let's say, popular in Turkey, especially until the 1980s. But starting with 1980s, I guess, of course, although we have also lots of Hamlet productions, starting with Muhsin Ertuğrul's performance in 1913, which is popular, of course. Of course, there are earlier versions as well. I would say that while Othello has ceased to be more popular, Hamlet has sustained, and there are many versions of it, and sometimes they have been politicized in certain crisis situations, like in the 2013 events in Turkey, and also in other means. And there have been also many multilingual or in different languages versions, like the 2014 Kurdish Hamlet, for instance, which is a kind of comedic, parodic retelling with musicals, lots of musical parts, which is fun. I don't understand any Kurdish, but it seems to be fun. And I would vote for Hamlet.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for this
rich
survey. I was curious, going back to maybe the early times, I was curious to know whether you had specific information as to the possible incentives implemented by the governments, the several governments under the presidencies of Mustafa Kemal, to encourage girls to become actors. That is to say, at first I had this feeling, maybe I'm wrong, do correct me if I'm wrong, that you had more international people, women, who had some international background because they had studied abroad, because they were of mixed origins themselves. And I got the impression that there was this sort of more maybe democratization. That is to say, you had more socially ordinary, I was about to say, I don't know if you understand my meaning, but would you say that this might be the consequence of some specific policies implemented by the government to enable, empower Turkish girls to become actresses? Would you say that this was a specific aspect in the governmental project?
Yes, I would say that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, despite many of the other, let's say, founding figures who were more patriarchal in their attitude, he was very eager that women got a public presence, not just in, let's say, in the arts, or that they were not just pinpointed into certain stereotypical professions, like being a teacher and the other things, but that they would also become scientists, historians, and other things. And there were many governmental schemes of funding young girls and women who would be encouraged to go abroad, and let's say they would be funded through some state scholarships. And these would not be just restricted to the well-to-do women in Turkey, like whether they were just part of the elite and they would just be sent to Europe, but there were also other schemes to find intelligent and hardworking girls and also boys in also, let's say, rural parts. And they would have also the opportunity to go abroad and then come back. And there are, of course, many examples which I cannot count here from other professions like painters, musicians, scientists, and the like, who have been encouraged in this way through some legalized and also usually through Atatürk's also personal insistence to go on with these reforms. Because in the early period of the Republic and even after that, people were just, okay, we have won the war, we have won the independence war, so just let's go back to the normal, and which also included even, let's say, female suffragists who were not quite comfortable with some of the reforms Atatürk did, like, for instance, Halide Edip, who was one of the founding chairs of the English Language and Literature Department in Istanbul University in the 1940s, and she was also an academic earlier, and also a freedom fighter, novelist. She's a very versatile figure. She was, for instance, against much of the, let's say, progressive policies the Republic had, because she thought, okay, according to her thought, which I don't share, that women should have a strong place in the house, in the home, and they should be just childbearers and family carers. They might be educated, but this education should be used in order to do the other chores. So there was a resistance on both sides of the genders, and despite that, Atatürk, and continuing well until, let's say, I would guess until the 1970s and 80s, this type of idea just continued. But by and by, we see that the resurgence of patriarchal ideas, and that some of these suppressed ideas that women should be just placed in their homes resurfaces. And that has been not just by conservative people, but also by so-called progressive people who just, let's say, marginalize certain women because of their looks or their origins or whatever. And hopefully, but again, these will be challenged and we will just move on. And that was also why I just wanted to talk about these female performers, to show, okay, we are not just famous for, let's say, Turkish Hamlets who are, or Turkish Shakespeares who are just practiced by men in Turkey, but these are some of the untold stories, especially in the international realm, that needs to be more attention, I guess.
Thank you. I definitely agree with you. Thank you so much for sharing.
You are welcome.
I'd like to invite us all to close the microphone once again to end the session.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. It has been such a great pleasure to be here. Have a nice day.
qui me fait l'amitié de venir alors que votre intervention était prévue l'année dernière. Donc par Zoom, ça aurait été un petit peu dommage de pouvoir et donc François Rostin et son assistant Pierre Berceau. Donc François Rostin est comédien, maître d'art, chorégraphe de combat. Il est professeur d'escrime scénique au conservatoire depuis 1987. Voilà. Et vous avez été formé à l'école Charles Dulin en tant que comédien. Vous avez joué au théâtre, à la télévision, au cinéma. Je sais que vous aviez tenu un rôle dans Midnight in Paris de Woody Allen. Très impressionnant. Et vous travaillez comme maître d'armes à la Comédie Française depuis 1986. Alors j'ai noté, je regardais les Shakespeare, donc La Nuit des Rois d'Andrzej Seweryn 2003, le magnifique Hamlet de Lavaudan en 1994. Je me souviens des combats avec Jack Nicholson, c'était magnifique. Sinon, vous avez travaillé avec, alors je n'en cite que quelques-uns parce que sinon j'en ai pour une heure, Stuart Side, Jacques Lassalle, Philippe Adrien, Yves Bonnen, Declan Donnellan, Anne Delbé, Adrian Noble, Robert Carson, Marcel Bluval, Jean-Michel Rive, Jean-Luc Benoît, Brigitte Jacques, Lucas Femlev, etc. Et pour les auteurs, voilà, les auteurs qui se prêtent à vos activités, Shakespeare, Corneille, Rostand, Schiller, Molière, Goldoni et bien d'autres. Vous travaillez aussi pour l'opéra, j'ai vu. Et vous avez votre salle d'art qui se trouve à Paris, en 9e, et donc vous avez un site internet. Donc, je vous invite, si vous voulez avoir plus d'informations à ce sujet, c'est lasalledarmes.com en un seul mot. La salle d'Armes. Voilà, donc, merci beaucoup. Voilà, je retourne à ma place, qui est très dangereux, un endroit très dangereux.
Non, il n'y a rien. Vous m'entendez bien là? Pardon?
Relativement.
Je vais essayer de parler.
Ah, voilà.
Donc voilà, je ne me présenterai pas, mais juste vous dire en quoi consiste un maître d'armes qui travaille dans le spectacle et un chorégraphe de combat. Ce sont deux choses qui sont liées évidemment. Le maître d'armes est plutôt un enseignant, donc pour former des comédiens qui ne veulent pas obligatoirement jouer une pièce, mais qui ont envie parce que c'est aussi, en tant que maître d'armes, c'est un, comment dire, voilà, pour résumer, je fais du théâtre avec des morceaux de bois et des morceaux de ferraille. Donc, l'escrime, c'est aussi un prétexte pour faire du théâtre. Donc, voilà. Le chorégraphe, il est au service d'une personne, un maître d'armes, qui est au service de la mise en scène, du metteur en scène, et donc qui travaille des comédiens sur des enchaînements, des gestes d'escrime, attaque, parade, riposte, qui forment tout ça un dialogue, qu'on appelle des phrases d'armes. Voilà. Donc, mon assistant Pierre, avec qui je travaille depuis 6 ans, comme vous avez présenté tout à l'heure, et qui est lui professeur de yoga, instructeur de Systema, c'est un art de combat russe, et voilà, qui est basé sur la biomécanique. C'est extrêmement intéressant, il y a beaucoup de rapports entre l'escrime, c'est aussi de la biomécanique. J'arrête là pour parler, parce que si je parle d'enseignement, je vais prendre des heures. Voilà, quand un metteur en scène décide donc de monter une pièce dans laquelle il y a un combat, notamment dans Shakespeare, en général, il fait donc appel à quelqu'un comme moi, parce que de nos jours, les escrimeurs ne courent pas les rues, contrairement à l'époque élisabéthaine, où vraisemblablement, tout le monde masculin savait se battre, plus ou moins bien. À l'époque, il n'y avait pas de chorégraphe de combat. Les rôles qui exigent une bonne maîtrise de l'escrime, par exemple, Hamlet, Roméo, le prince Hal, Macbeth, Coriolan et leurs adversaires, Laerte, Tybalt, Hotspur, Macduff, Ophidius, ainsi que Mercutio ou Falstaff, pour n'en citer que quelques-uns, sont créés par les 3 fines lames de la troupe, Richard Burbage en tête, ainsi que William Sly et Thomas Pope. Ce sont eux, vraisemblablement, qui réglaient eux-mêmes leur combat. Alors je dis régler plutôt que chorégraphier, parce que comme ces comédiens savaient se battre, ils devaient probablement se mettre d'accord en amont sur comment commencer et terminer leur combat et improviser entre les deux en direct. Dans le texte, on a très peu d'indications sur le déroulement des combats, à l'exception de Roméo et Juliette et de Hamlet. J'en parlerai. Tout ce qu'on trouve en didascalie, c'est « ils se battent » ou « scène de guerre ». En production, on doit donc se débrouiller avec ça. Alors, comment est-ce qu'ils se battent? Avec quelles armes? Pendant combien de temps? Avec quelle violence? Qui se bat honorablement? Qui se bat en employant des coups bas? Le vainqueur gagne-t-il le combat parce qu'il est plus habile techniquement, ou plus fort physiquement, ou plus déterminé? Toutes ces questions sont a priori laissées aux soins du metteur en scène. Mais en général, le metteur en scène est confié au maître d'armes parce que la maîtrise technique du geste entre en jeu, et aussi parce que le maître d'armes peut repérer des choses dans le texte que le metteur en scène ne saisit pas nécessairement. Selon moi, la chorégraphie d'un combat est comme une mise en scène à l'intérieur de la mise en scène. Elle doit intégrer les parties prises de la production pour servir à la mise en scène et s'appuyer sur le texte. En ce qui concerne les parties prises de la production, c'est l'époque ou l'esthétique choisie par le metteur en scène qui va le plus souvent déterminer le choix des armes et donc la technique de combat. La construction des personnages et des situations va guider ensuite ma chorégraphie dans le choix des gestes. Par exemple, j'ai récemment chorégraphié les combats du roi Lear dans la mise en scène de Georges Labaudan. Alors, imaginez une scénographie dépouillée, des costumes intemporels, plutôt modernes avec des emprunts au XIXe siècle. Alors, si j'avais proposé une épée médiévale, par exemple, ça aurait fait tâche. Donc, il me fallait une arme neutre, aussi neutre que possible, mais qui reste une vraie arme de combat pour augmenter l'enjeu des affrontements. J'ai donc opté pour une arme très sobre, un modèle de sabre polonais du XIXe siècle, que j'ai fait fabriquer la lame en duraluminium, qui sonne mieux que l'acier. Tout ça pour augmenter encore l'effet. Pour le personnage d'Edgar, déguisé en pauvre Tom, lorsqu'il se bat contre Oswald, qui a lui un sabre à la main, j'ai également opté pour un simple bâton de marche, un gros bâton commun, compagnon du pèlerin, plutôt que le gourdin mentionné par Edgar lui-même. Toutes choses qui ont permis au combat à la fois de s'intégrer esthétiquement à la mise en scène et de révéler des facettes des personnages, notamment l'adresse d'Edgar à l'emporter sur le sabre grâce à sa maîtrise de la technique du bâton. Alors, en ce qui concerne le texte, l'histoire de l'escrime et sa terminologie permettent de démêler d'autres choses. Commençons par la terminologie, illustrée par les armes et les Parmi les armes blanches mentionnées par Shakespeare, la plus fréquente, parce que c'est un terme générique, c'est sword, l'épée. Mais une fois qu'on a dit épée, on n'est pas très avancé. Terme générique oblige. C'est par exemple le terme utilisé dans le roi Lear. On trouve plus spécifiquement le terme rapier, la rapière, et foil, le fleuret. Épée, rapière, fleuret. C'est là que l'histoire de l'escrime peut nous éclairer, d'autant que Shakespeare semble utiliser ces termes de façon interchangeable. Dans la première moitié du XVIe siècle, en Angleterre, l'arme nationale, issue de la lourde épée médiévale, est une épée pourvue d'une simple poignée en croix. Et on se bat effectivement avant tout avec cette épée et un broquet. Sword and buckler. Un broquet, c'est un petit bouclier dont le diamètre varie de 20 à 30 cm. Là, j'ai choisi ceux de 30 cm, c'est un peu plus sécure, surtout en spectacle. Mais il y avait des petits broquets qui pouvaient mettre attachés à la ceinture. Alors, donc on va vous montrer un petit peu comment se sert de cette arme-là. Regardez ici. Donc, n'ayez pas peur pour le bruit. Vous ne respirez bien parce qu'on est. Voilà. pas recevoir un coup dans les dents. Alors, bien sûr, il y a des techniques aussi. Là, je suis rentré dans l'art, lui aussi d'ailleurs. On va parler. Donc, maintenant, voilà, par exemple. On va s'arrêter là. Vous voyez, c'est quand même assez primitif. Hein, parce que, pourquoi j'ai ça? Parce que s'il m'attaque, bah, c'est quand même mieux que la main et que les dents. Alors je pourrais évidemment, c'est pour ça qu'on va poser les paupières, parce qu'on se battait aussi avec une main. Donc, les coudes étaient tranchés. Voilà. Comment arrêter un peu comme ça? Alors, en spectacle, sinon, les gens sont là. Tu fais 1, 2, 3. Non, non. C'est ridicule. Je sais qu'est-ce qu'il fait là. Donc voilà. Donc, les vrais goûts, c'est. S'il fait ça, je dirais soit il peut casser sa lame, ou alors de marche souvent dans la figure. Donc, il y avait des techniques. Vous voyez bien là? Ouais, non, hein. Donc, il y avait des techniques. Il fallait que. Alors, soit j'esquivais, ce qui m'attaquait la jambe, par exemple. Voilà. Alors là, il va aller plus lentement parce qu'il va trop pour moi. Voilà. Et en esquivant, je vais couper un peu le poignet. Ce qui me permet après d'avoir un petit temps de vacances sur lui. D'accord? Alors, il y a ça. Donc, on travaille sur l'esquive. Mais aussi, surtout, ce qu'on appelle, je ne sais pas s'il y a des gens qui ont fait des esquives ici. Ah, il y avait le principe de la contre-attaque. La contre-attaque, c'est prendre un temps sur l'attaque adverse. Parce que dans les livres de cette époque, fin 16e, parer, c'était considéré comme être lâche, on ne pouvait rien faire. Donc il y avait un gars qui s'appelle Joachim Meyer qui a fait un bouquin absolument splendide en 1570, qui dit qu'il faut se ruer sur l'autre. Et c'est l'expression, finalement, l'attaque c'est la meilleure défense. Je ne sais pas si ça vient de là, mais c'était vraiment le cas. Donc, on y va au ralenti parce qu'on va finir la conférence à deux. Sur son attaque, par exemple, je rentrais dans son attaque en gardant bien sûr le contact pour pouvoir après continuer l'action. Donc ça peut être, je peux m'attaquer ici, voilà, je prends ici, donc là, là, on recommence, pardon. Voilà, regardez, je profite de l'inertie pour le frapper. Voilà. Donc, c'était des techniques, il fallait oser. D'accord, je comprends qu'on soit cordonnier ou moine plutôt que. C'est ça. Je ne sais pas si à l'époque, j'aurais fait que. Alors, je continue. Merci. Donc, et pendant ce temps, en Italie, les choses se raffinent, si l'on peut dire. Et une nouvelle arme apparaît, le fil, plus légère que l'épée médiévale, parce qu'on la porte désormais en ville. Cette première arme citadine, portée sur le côté, s'appelle d'ailleurs en italien spada da lazzo, littéralement épée de côté. Voilà, dans un fourreau, bien sûr. Vous voyez, c'est quand même une. Donc, et en Espagne, on l'appelle spada ropera, d'où le nom de rapière, c'est-à-dire l'épée de manteau, car on la cache sous le manteau. Bon, il faut savoir qu'à l'époque, c'était la cape. Je montre la rapière en tasse. Dans la tasse. Voilà. Alors, c'était des lames plus longues. Voilà, plus longues. Et le principe, j'ai un petit peu ici. Donc, ça, c'était important. Avec des lames un peu plus longues. Merci. Tout le monde connaît ce genre de. On le voit dans la trompe mousquetaire. J'en suis. Alors, voilà. Donc, la rapière a aussi une lame plus légère. Je montre la. Oui, si tu veux. Il y en a deux. Voilà, j'ai fait monter, regardez ces dames. Tu peux me montrer, voilà. Elles sont très longues. Et là, ce ne sont pas des armes de spectacle, je peux vous l'assurer. Elles mesurent presque 1 mètre. Alors, j'ai un peu oublié de vous montrer quelques gravures. Vous pouvez faire passer. Vous verrez une femme avec un petit broquet. Ça n'a pas tellement évolué. Donc, qui prend les cours d'estime d'un clerc. Vous pouvez vous faire passer, vous me rendez la main. Donc, et les femmes faisaient des signes. C'est vraiment important. Pas beaucoup, hein. C'était des privilégiés, évidemment. Donc, après, on peut en discuter des heures. Donc, je disais que la rapière a une âme plus légère, mince, tranchante, mais surtout faite pour les stocks, la pointe. Les stocks qui auraient apparemment donné le terme tuck en anglais, utilisé pour désigner une arme de pointe. Arme de pointe, donc, la lame de la rapière est aussi par conséquent plus longue. Et c'est par ailleurs en Italie, davantage qu'en Espagne, que va se développer pleinement la technique de cette arme. Montaigne qui pratique l'escrime, va en Italie pour se former à cette arme nouvelle et constate que beaucoup de ses concitoyens font la même chose. Donc, on va vous montrer un petit peu les techniques de rapière. Ce ne sont pas des techniques théâtrales. Donc, on va prendre des poignards. Parce que ça, ben oui, parce que ça n'ayez pas peur, n'ayez pas peur. Vous êtes tous là. Non. Je suis maladroit, mais pas considérable. Quand je plante un cul, ce n'est pas la même chose. Donc, voilà. Ça remplace un peu le broquel. Donc, vous pouvez couper le lard, vous couper le jambon, alors, ça, c'est une main gauche. C'est une dame qui fait une main gauche. C'est son nom. C'est les 3/4 des gens, les 9/10 des gens sont droitiers, donc il a ça, il la porte dans sa main. Alors, moi qui suis gaucher, quand je porte, je ne sais pas comment le dire. Voilà, là, je me fais à droite pour vous, mais là, j'aurais ça dans la main droite. Ça s'appelle toujours une main gauche, avec comprendre. Donc, action simple, beaucoup de pointes. Hein. Alors, en spectacle, on fait du tic, tac, 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 j'en parlerai. Donc, par exemple, voilà. Je pars ici, et voilà. Là, voilà. Donc, on montre des choses très simples. Ça vient étapement où tu veux. Je prends ici, je reprends ici. Voilà. Ici. C'est pour ça que c'est un peu tranchant. Un peu le jardin. Oui. Ah oui, tout à fait. Ok, je t'attaque. Bon, voilà. Je t'attaque encore au visage, dans les yeux. Alors, ce genre d'arme, pas les gendarmes, mais ce genre, on ne peut pas faire des parades de poste comme on fait avec des armes légères. Non, je ne peux pas faire ça, parce que si je fais ça, d'abord, je suis lent, et là, je suis embêtant. Donc, voilà. Donc, ou alors je ruge, c'est la même chose. 1, 2, et là, par exemple. Ça va? Ah, d'accord. Donc, voilà. Donc, alors, en général, ça se tient comme ça. Dans les films, des fois, ils le tiennent comme ça, mais c'est avec lui. Maintenant, alors, celle-là, voilà, celle-là, voilà, celle-là, voilà, ça c'est affreux. Hein. On est en 1610, c'est pas très loin. Tenez, parce que vous voulez faire passer de l'autre côté? Ce serait bien. Ah non, c'est une autre. Non, plus de travaux, c'est. Voilà, oui, celle-là, avec le broquel. Ça, c'est 1573, voilà. Derrière, vous pouvez voir la date. C'est marqué la date derrière. C'est vraiment la Révolution. On est en 1553. Agrippa, c'est italien. Il aimait bien les nuls. Hein. Et on était seul. Monsieur qui a fait des films, quand même. Voilà. Alors, on travaille à la bougie, c'est pour ça qu'il n'y a pas d'écran, etc. Moi, j'aime bien les gravures. On est en 1567, Jean Puat, c'est 1578, donc on est vraiment, c'est vraiment dingue et rapière. C'est des arbres très ordinaires. Alors, on peut aussi se battre à la rapière. Hein, comment ça se passe? Moi, j'interdis les comédiens d'avoir des trucs comme ça. Donc, même chose, c'est un petit peu les mêmes principes que l'épée, attaquer sur des contre-attaques. C'est-à-dire que si tu m'attaques à la jambe, je pars ici, regardez, je pars, mais regardez où est la pointe. Elle est déjà dans sa cuisse. Ou alors, si j'ai une petite traction, je la monte dans la gorge, par exemple. Il y a une gravure qui explique ça. Il y a toujours plusieurs possibilités. Vas-y, je t'attaque ici, voilà. Là, il vient de faire, on le verra tout à l'heure, une punta reversa. Donc, on parle dans Shakespeare, dans Roméo et Juliette en particulier. Punta, la pointe, mais pointe de Robert. Encore une dernière, je t'attaque orange, tiens. Voilà, même chose. Alors là, il arrive par ce côté, donc il explique de caver la possibilité, il fait quelque chose. Donc, il y a toujours des possibilités. Je garde, le principe, c'est que je garde le fer de l'eau. Garder le fer, c'est que je garde le contact. Voilà. En ces temps de garder le contact. Donc, voilà. Si... Ouais. Oui. Regardez. Si vous voulez peser ces arbres, vous les rendez après. Certaines, mais par exemple, mais c'était assez rare. Ça va, c'est pas trop lourd. Si vous voulez regarder, voilà.
S'il y a des jaloux, je me tiendrai disponible à la fin de la conférence pour les arbres.
D'accord. Merci Pierre. Donc je continue. Alors. Maintenant, passons au fleuret. Le mot lui-même fait son apparition dans un traité d'escrime en français en 1573. Où est-ce qu'il est? Je vais donner. Madame, c'est peut-être montré là, ici? Non, c'est pas ça. C'est ça, voilà. Monsieur Cassard, regardez, c'est un désarmement. Ils appellent cette arme, ils appellent ça un fleuret. Eh oui. Donc, c'est un ouvrage d'Henri Saint-Didier qui s'appelle Traité contenant les secrets du premier livre sur l'épaisseur. Et on le retrouve quelques années plus tard aussi, ce mot de fleuret, dans les essais de Montaigne. Ça s'écrivait un peu différemment, fleurette, F-L-O-R-E-T. Cette arme est spécifiquement conçue pour l'entraînement. Elle est identique à la rapière, mais le fil de sa lame est émoussé et sa pointe repliée. Le fil, c'est le tranchant. Sa pointe repliée, d'où vraisemblablement son nom anglais, fall, qui viendrait du vieux français fouler, refouler, au sens de retourner, replier. Ce n'est qu'à partir de la seconde moitié du XVIIe siècle que le fleuret devient une arme mouchetée. Mouchetée par du fil poissé ou par une boule d'étoupe ou par un petit bouton de cuir, parce qu'il correspond alors à la nouvelle épée à la mode, l'épée de cour. Donc, ça, merci, c'est un authentique faux. Non, mais c'est une réplique vraiment très très bien faite d'un fleuret du XVIIe siècle. La lame était un peu rigide, et vous voyez, il y a une petite garde comme dans les rapières. Vous voyez la garde? Et qui s'est simplifiée au XVIIIe siècle par une garde en 8, avec, regardez, ça c'est du plastoc, hein, mais voilà, c'était du cuir. Regardez la lame. Donc,
c'est moucheté, hein.
Donc, le but, c'est de toucher, c'est pas de tuer dans l'entraînement. Donc, pour travailler, mais quand on regarde, voilà, par exemple, je vais vraiment aller sur des choses très, très, très fines. C'est vraiment important. Et ça, c'est un fleuret moderne que je vous montrerai tout à l'heure, pour voir l'évolution des fleurets, avec une poignée, ce qu'on appelle poignée crosse. Voilà, 2 compétitions que vous pouvez voir actuellement. Pour la petite histoire, puisque quand même, je vous ai amené des armes modernes, des armes olympiques. Il y a le sabre, qui est une arme d'entraînement. Ce n'est pas les gros sabres de cavalerie, ce n'est pas une arme de guerre. Et je vais le faire passer, vous regarderez que le bout est retourné comme exactement comme les fleurets de l'époque. Sauf qu'avant, c'était des grosses lames. Vous voyez? Donc voilà. Et puis l'épée moderne, voilà, qui ressemble à l'épée du 19e siècle, un petit peu aux épées du mousquetaire.
Ça, c'est l'épée de compétition.
Oui, c'est l'épée de compétition.
Une arme d'entraînement, mais c'est comme ça.
Des gardes comme ça ou des gardes comme les poignées crosses, comme celle-ci. Qui tient comme un pistolet. Voilà. Tout ça pour s'entraîner, je ferai, à l'épée de cour. Voici une épée de cour. C'était bien pointu, on pouvait tuer son homme sans problème avec ça. Il y a beaucoup, toute l'aristocratie dans les années 13e siècle, pendant 50 ans, il y a je ne sais pas combien de milliers de jeunes gens qui sont morts. Donc voilà, ça c'est vraiment l'épée de cour et ça ressemble au fleuret. Donc voilà, on peut, avec des armes comme ça, il était interdit de s'entraîner dans les salles d'armes. Ouais, donc je continue. Alors, où s'en suit? Voilà, donc le fleuret, tel qu'il existe à l'époque élisabéthaine, donc, est de courte durée, puisque dès la seconde moitié, donc les grosses lames, hein, donc dès la seconde moitié du XVIIe siècle, sa lame devient flexible, comme je vous l'ai montré, comme on peut le voir avec les modèles fin XVIIe, XVIIIe, et voilà, ou le fleuret moderne. C'est surtout la lame qui est importante, voilà. Voilà, donc, le fleuret en anglais, le fleuret moderne s'appelle toujours foil. Alors, cela ne signifie pas qu'il ne faut pas traduire foil par le mot fleuret dans le texte de Shakespeare, mais simplement qu'il ne faut pas se tromper d'arme si on veut monter les productions au costume d'époque de façon rigoureuse. En ce qui concerne la traduction, utiliser l'expression d'arme mouchetée ou démouchetée ne respecte pas la vérité historique, même s'il est vrai que l'expression est sans doute plus parlante pour le public aujourd'hui. En même temps, Shakespeare, lui, ne se gêne pas de ce point de vue-là. Dans la plupart de ses pièces historiques, ou encore dans Titus Andronicus, les personnages se battent spécifiquement avec des rapières, qui n'existent évidemment pas du tout à l'époque où sont censés se passer ces drames. Mais il arrive aussi à Shakespeare de mentionner spécifiquement des armes hors d'usage à la fin du XVIe siècle, telles que le fauchon, falchion, en anglais, une épée large, incurvée, proche du cimeterre, pour évoquer un temps définitivement révolu, comme le fait Lear au moment de mourir, par exemple. Pour résumer, pendant toute la Renaissance, on assiste à une véritable révolution de l'escrime qui va donner naissance à l'escrime moderne et qui démarre donc en Italie et en Espagne avant de se répandre dans le reste de l'Europe. L'escrime, jusque-là militaire, devient également civil. Les armes changent, les techniques s'adaptent, les différentes écoles se développent, 4 principalement, italiennes, espagnoles, françaises, allemandes. Les traités d'escrime voient le jour, les salles d'armes s'ouvrent. En Angleterre, par exemple, Henri VIII doit d'ailleurs réglementer l'accès à la profession de maître d'armes en 1540. Et le combat en duel lui-même se transforme. Alors, à l'origine, le duel est judiciaire, appelé aussi jugement de Dieu ou jugement par combat. Un combat singulier dont on considère le vainqueur comme bien fondé puisque désigné par Dieu. Et on en a un parfait exemple dans Richard III entre Mowbray et Bolingbroke. Oui, Richard II, sorry. Merci, pardon. C'est ma langue qui a surpris. Et donc, on a un parfait exemple dans Richard II entre Mowbray et Bolingbroke. En pratique, ce duel judiciaire tombe en désuétude au XVIe siècle, mais il est encore très vivant dans la conscience collective et les combats de certaines tragédies en témoignent, comme dans le dénouement de Macbeth ou du roi Lear. Au même moment, apparaît le duel d'honneur comme un dévoiement du duel judiciaire pour régler des conflits personnels, comme c'est le cas dans Roméo et Juliette, où le terme de duelliste apparaît pour la première fois dans la bouche de Mercutio, lorsqu'il dresse le portrait menaçant de Tybalt. Un mot qu'il répète 2 fois de suite, de façon péjorative d'ailleurs. C'est à peu près à la même époque, dans une comédie cette fois, Peine d'amour perdu, qu'on trouve la première mention du terme duello. Alors, en italien dans le texte, comme très souvent les termes d'escrime. On peut noter au passage que dans les comédies, le duel est souvent ridiculisé et même dénoncé comme une pratique futile, voire comme l'exercice par excellence des lâches, comme dans La Nuit des Rois, par exemple. Pour revenir on va revenir à notre révolution de l'escrime. On trouve dans la comédie de Henry Porter, The Two Angry Women of Abingdon, pardon pour l'accent, publié en 1599, la réplique suivante. Le combat à l'épée et au bouclier commence à être hors d'usage. J'en suis fâché. Je ne verrai plus jamais le véritable courage. Si jamais le combat à la rapière et au poignard devient à la mode, alors l'homme fort, un vrai brave, se verra embroché comme un chat ou comme un simple lapin. Alors, entre parenthèses, on peut rappeler que Henry Porter est lui-même mort d'un coup de rapière, en duel contre un autre dramaturge. Pas Ben Jonson, qui, lui, a tué l'acteur Gabriel Spencer. Non, qui lui-même avait tué quelqu'un d'autre. Non, pas Marlowe, qui a, lui aussi, été assassiné. Bon, autre temps, autre meurtre. Combat à l'épée et au bouclier, d'un côté, donc, et combat à la rapière et au poignard, de l'autre. On est au cœur de cette grande transformation de l'escrime qui se manifeste également dans l'œuvre de Shakespeare, ce qui signifie donc bien que tout le monde, à l'époque, est au fait de cette transformation et de ces enjeux. J'ai évoqué les traités d'escrime tout à l'heure. Ceux qui circulent en Angleterre à la fin du XVIe siècle sont rédigés par des maîtres italiens comme Di Grassi, dont l'ouvrage de 1570 est traduit en anglais en 1594. Ou encore Saviolo, maître d'armes du comte d'Essex, qui publie un ouvrage directement en anglais en 1595. En 1599, un gentilhomme anglais du nom de George Silver publie un traité pour se poser en champion des anciens maîtres nationaux et railler l'engouement populaire pour ces maîtres étrangers. Silver déplore par exemple que ces escrimeurs italiens nous apprennent l'offensive et non la défensive. Alors, entre parenthèses, en Angleterre, on appelle l'escrime la noble science de la défense. D'où le terme anglais de fencing, du vieux français défense. Je ferme la parenthèse et je reprends ma citation de Silver. Ils excitent, donc Silver, ils excitent les hommes à s'entrégorger chez eux en temps de paix, à l'aide d'un instrument qui n'est même pas bon à faire du mal à l'ennemi en temps de guerre. Quand il arrive le moment du combat, c'est à peine s'ils trouvent assez de place pour tirer du fourreau leur broche de cuisinier. Une fois tirés, que peuvent-ils faire? Peuvent-ils de la pointe percer une cuirasse? Peuvent-ils détacher un casque? Je tiens ton tête au pic par des stoccata, des rivelsa, des dritta. On va vous montrer ce que c'est une stoccata, une rivelsa, une dritta. Vous les avez vus, mais je vous donne non. Pardon, oui. Bon, voilà. Oui, par des coups semblables, baptisés de termes aussi ronflants. Non. Ces jouets, dit Silver, conviennent à des enfants et non pas à des hommes. Ils sont bons tout au plus aux maraudeurs des champs pour massacrer la volaille et non à des vaillants qui veulent combattre leurs ennemis. Alors. Après. Pardon. Normal, c'est après. Donc, dritta, c'est tout ce qui vient de la droite. Je suis en droitier, dritta. Voilà. Ça, c'est une dritta. Ça, c'est une punta riversa. Donc, c'est un coup de revers, riversa, et punta la pointe. Et stoccata, alors, dans le stoccata, c'est très bien. Il parle de stoccata, il n'en parle pas Shakespeare, mais par exemple, la stoccata, c'est tout ce qui se passe en dessous de la marne. Ça, c'est la marne. Et il y a un autre terme dont Shakespeare n'en parle pas, mais comme ça vous le saurez. Imbrocata, c'est tout ce qui arrive au-dessus d'un arbre. Voilà. Merci. Alors, ces critiques donc de Silver, sont d'autant plus véhémentes qu'il s'agit de s'opposer à la source la plus influente de tous les traités du XVIe siècle, et qui est l'ouvrage majeur de 1536, Opera Nova de Marozzo. Donc vous avez vu déjà, à ceux qui ont circulé avec les petits broquels, ça c'est, on est en 1536, et tiens, voilà celle-là, voilà. Le grand maître d'armes de Bologne, c'est sous sa plume qu'on trouve pour la première fois la description des gestes techniques selon les armes et selon qu'il s'agit d'escrime de guerre, d'escrime de duel ou d'escrime de salle, ainsi que toutes les règles qui président au déclenchement du duel, avec notamment les différentes manières de dire à quelqu'un qu'il a menti. Et on peut se demander si cette progression verbale est destinée à freiner l'escalade ou bien à l'accélérer. À vous de juger. Premièrement, vous vous éloignez de la vérité. Deuxièmement, vous savez que c'est faux. Troisièmement, vous mentez par la gorge. Quatrièmement, vous mentez par votre gorge, comme un gredin que vous êtes. Des formules qu'on retrouve dans plusieurs pièces de Shakespeare, car à l'évidence, il connaît bien ces traités, y compris celui de Marozzo, dont il se moque aussi, notamment lorsqu'il fait de cet art de la querelle un art d'éviter le duel, comme dans la scène Comme il vous plaira, où le bouffon raconte une escalade verbale qui se termine par le fait de comparer la longueur des épées et de se séparer bon ami. Le bouffon précise d'ailleurs nous nous corrélons au pied de la lettre selon les règles du traité, de même qu'il y a des traités de bonne manière. Un autre détail de même ordre, dans la nuit des rois, cette fois, c'est le conseil que donne Sir Toby à Sir Andrew pour montrer sa bravoure de blesser son adversaire en 11 endroits. Ces 11 cibles sont très clairement représentées dans l'ouvrage de Marozzo par une illustration qu'on ne retrouve dans aucun autre ouvrage publié à l'époque. Et se laisse à penser que Shakespeare connaissait cet ouvrage. Peut-être cela, c'est peut-être Marozzo, c'est ça. Ouais, c'est bon. Là, vous voyez, c'est cette espèce de personnage. Il y a, alors, dans Marozzo, c'est étrange parce que c'est 9 points, alors que notre ami Shakespeare, on parle de 11. Alors, je vais vous les montrer quand même. Je vais prendre des lire, c'est vraiment ça, c'est des armes de spectacle, ça se peut découvrir. Donc, les 11 points, c'est très simple. Hein. Le terme scolambrito, c'est une diagonale. Donc, c'est dritto, scolambrito, reverso, scolambrito, dritto, tondo, horizontal, reverso, tondo, qui fait 4. Vous voyez tous? Reverso, candente, c'est par envers. Dritto, candente. Maintenant, il y a le tranchant et il y a le faux tranchant. Donc, falso manco. C'est quoi falso manco? Le coup de Jarnac. Vous avez entendu parler du coup de Jarnac? C'est un coup de falso manco. Avec le faux tranchant. C'est très efficace. C'est la meilleure de l'année. Et puis, falso manco et falso dritto. Et puis, on revient là. Montante. C'est primitif mais efficace. On doit être à 10. Et puis, le dernier, stoccata. Yes. Donc, c'est vraiment intéressant. J'ai appris plein de choses.
C'est nous qui apprenons.
Non, mais moi aussi. Donc, je connaissais les points de Marozzo, mais je ne sais pas que. Voilà. Je vous raconte pas ma vie, ne vous inquiétez pas. Alors, j'en suis où? Tatin. Voilà. Donc, là encore, de la part de Shakespeare, c'est une forme de connivence avec les plus fins connaisseurs de son public, mais aussi une façon de distinguer Sir Toby par son érudition en la matière. Car l'arme et la technique avec lesquelles se bat le personnage sont de véritables marqueurs sociaux pour n'importe quel public de l'époque. Dans Henri IV, première partie, Hotspur, pour exprimer son mépris pour le prince Hal, le traite de Sword on Buckler, Prince of Wales. Un prince qui se bat à l'épée et au bouclier. Épée et bouclier qu'on retrouve dans Roméo et Juliette, entre les mains des gens du peuple, les serviteurs de la maison Capulet, tandis que dans cette même pièce, les citoyens se battent, eux, avec massue, pique et pertuisanes, clubs, bills and partisans. Le vieux Capulet, lui, avec sa longue épée, longue sword, une grande épée à deux mains, et c'est une arme lourde qui daterait de sa jeunesse et s'utilise avec les deux mains. Et quant aux jeunes gentilshommes, Tybalt, Benvolio, Mercutio et Roméo, ils se battent avec l'arme à la pointe de la mode parmi les courtisans, la rapière, bien sûr. Cette répartition très précise est donc bien une façon d'identifier les personnages par leurs armes, exactement comme le registre de la langue peut le faire. Et les détails techniques ont leur importance. Quand Mercutio avertit Benvolio de la virtuosité de duelliste de Tybalt, il cite l'immortel passado, le punto reverso et le aille. Le aille. Soit une estocade, voilà. La passada, c'était un peu un terme espagnol. C'était une manière de maintenant, les escrivains modernes, c'était une manière presque naturelle de marcher. Donc, le côté, c'était passada, comme plutôt reverso, je peux faire une passada, je peux faire aussi une passada. Voilà, c'est une manière de. Il y avait tout un travail sur le circulaire. D'ailleurs, dans la gravure, on voit cette figure de tour. On ne restait pas qu'en face. Et voilà. Et le aille, alors, le aille. Ça évoque la formule italienne, aille, il colpo. Tu as le coup, tu as la touche. C'est vraiment le coup qui vient. Merci. Alors, après quoi, Mercutio se déchaîne, que la vérole emporte ces fantasmes grotesques, affectés, zézéiants, avec leur nouvel accent à la mode. N'est-ce pas une chose lamentable que nous soyons ainsi affligés de ces parasites étrangers, ces colporteurs de mode qui sont aussi pointilleux sur les façons nouvelles? Et il finit par traiter Tybalt de scélérat qui se bat en suivant son livre d'arithmétique. Alors, ça c'est italien, mais je n'ai pas sur moi, mais il y avait vraiment. Il y a tout un processus géométrique complètement ésotérique et difficile à comprendre. Qu'est-ce que c'est que ce livre d'arithmétique? Ce livre renvoie très certainement à l'école espagnole, qui est fondée sur des rapports géométriques extrêmement complexes, si complexes qu'ils en deviennent obscurs et qui sont d'ailleurs rarement repris par l'école italienne. On pourrait donc imaginer que Mercutio dénonce spécifiquement l'influence espagnole. Mais Mercutio qualifie aussi Tybalt de vrai boucher pour les boutons de soie. Et ça renvoie à une anecdote très populaire à l'époque au sujet du célèbre maître d'armes italien Rocco Bonetti, qui instruit la fine fleur de la société à des prix exorbitants, jusqu'à 50 fois supérieurs au tarif des maîtres d'armes anglais. Vous voyez le problème que ça peut poser. On pourrait même imaginer que la rivalité entre les Montaigu, on pourrait imaginer que la rivalité entre les Montaigu et les Capulet reflète la concurrence entre anciens, modernes et modernes, c'est-à-dire entre maîtres anglais et maîtres étrangers, principalement italiens, donc, même si le drame se déroule à Vérone. Mais on sait bien que Shakespeare use de la géographie exotique comme de l'histoire ancienne. Ces commentaires de Mercutio restent, en tout cas, comme autant de détails piquants à l'attention d'un public très averti. Donc. Alors, qui dit public très averti de tous ces signes qui traversent le texte, dit aussi nécessairement public à qui on ne la fait pas. Quand on passe à l'action, les indications qu'on trouve dans Roméo et Juliette sur le meurtre de Mercutio par Tybalt, puis de Tybalt par Roméo, sont exceptionnelles dans la précision des gestes, car tout est raconté en détail par Benvolio, qui précise que les passes d'armes furent d'une extrême rapidité. Mercutio est en effet à peine égratigné par Tybalt, mais c'est une touche mortelle, car il s'agit précisément d'une technique de pointe, beaucoup moins spectaculaire que la technique de tranchant, mais bien plus dangereuse. J'ai besoin d'un Roméo, d'une Roméo. Volontaire, voilà. Merci. Tiens, alors, tu fais percussion. On va prendre la pierre. Voilà. Mets-toi là, t'es ici. Roméo, vous êtes là. Vous avez les pieds ici. Vous avez la pierre. Et là, l'idée, c'est qu'ils se battent. Vous êtes d'accord? Et puis à un moment donné, qu'est-ce qu'il y a quand deux personnes se battent, c'est arrêter. Donc, on est ici, donc vous venez un peu sur le début. Voilà, arrêtez. Et comme vous êtes mon ami, pas me battre, etc., vous venez devant, moi je suis là. Voilà, vous venez devant ma question. Voilà. Hé, bouge pas le bras, c'est parfait. Et voilà, restez le bras comme ça. Je ne suis pas la droite. Qu'est-ce que tu fais? Ça va dire très très rapide. Un seul coup. Il passe sous le bras de Roméo et il est gratiné, entre guillemets.
On a fait? Maintenant, j'ai compris la sauce.
Non! Donc, on continue. Cela donc nous laisse supposer que les combats de l'époque devaient être très différents de ce que l'on pratique de nos jours sur scène, où l'on s'efforce d'agrandir le geste, de l'augmenter de pareille de riposte à l'attention d'un public aujourd'hui nourri aux combats spectaculaires du cinéma. Là, on ne peut pas faire concurrence. Les acteurs de l'époque devaient en effet probablement se battre au plus près d'une technique de combat réelle qui visait avant tout l'efficacité. Ah, allô? Pardon. Au passage, on peut noter que Richard Burbage, principal escrimeur de la troupe, avait pour instructeur et pour beau-frère le fameux Rocco Bonetti, dont la salle d'armes était installée dans les locaux d'un théâtre désaffecté, récupéré de façon pas très loyale apparemment, en 1596 par Burbage père, et Shakespeare pourrait fonder un premier théâtre avant la construction du globe quelques années plus tard. Donc, devant un public friand, tu montres la salle d'armes. C'est une salle d'armes 18e, et pour vous dire que les salles d'armes, je pense que c'est dans un jeu de paume. Il y a beaucoup de salles d'armes dans les théâtres. Voilà. On est au 18e siècle, mais ça n'a pas beaucoup changé. Donc, j'en reviens à... Oui, donc pour fonder ce premier théâtre avant la construction du globe, quelques années plus tard, devant un public friand de spectacles violents, la fosse aux ours était tout près du théâtre. Les acteurs avaient donc clairement intérêt à se battre avec le plus grand réalisme, et l'adresse de ces comédiens à le faire sans se blesser a certainement contribué au succès des pièces, notamment Hamlet, dont le final culmine avec ce qui reste sans doute le duel le plus célèbre de toute l'œuvre de Shakespeare. Ce duel, c'est aussi le plus complexe parce qu'il est en même temps, pour la cour, exhibition d'escrime. Pour Hamlet, rencontre sportive pour réparer les liens fraternels. Pour le roi, meurtre déguisé. Pour la Herth, duel d'honneur. Et à l'échelle de l'œuvre, duel judiciaire. Pour le public, il est évidemment tout cela à la fois, et surtout la perspective d'un combat virtuose entre la Herth, revenu de France et passé maître dans l'art et la pratique de l'escrime et surtout de la rapière, et Hamlet, qui dit ne pas avoir cessé de s'exercer et qui passe enfin à l'action. L'assaut. Oui, on va montrer ça aussi pour vous dire que, regardez comme ils s'entretuent les gens. Des jeunes hommes de 18 ans. Il y en a d'autres encore qui Ah ouais, c'est ça. C'est pas grave. Vous voyez le fleuret du XVIIe siècle? Il se plie, il était destiné à toucher avec les petites boules. Mais ça n'existait pas à l'époque de Shakespeare, comme je vous l'ai déjà dit. Alors, on est en 1696, donc on est 100 ans plus tard. Donc, je continuais sur Hamlet. L'assaut est donc extrêmement formalisé Et comme la pièce représentée plutôt par les acteurs engagés par Hamlet, c'est du théâtre dans le théâtre, où l'on est censé se battre pour de faux. La didascalie de ce combat est d'ailleurs they play et non they fight. Et le terme utilisé pour les armes est toujours foil, même si au moment du complot, à l'acte précédent, c'est une arme non émoussée que le roi prévoit pour la herte. A sword unbaited. Et on comprend d'autant mieux pourquoi Hamlet ne remarque pas la différence entre les lames qu'il n'examine pas de près comme le roi l'avait anticipé. À lui tout seul, cet affrontement, par sa nature plurielle, par sa transformation progressive, mais également par sa durée exceptionnelle, est aussi l'exact contrepoint de tous les duels escamotés qu'on trouve dans les comédies. Sur scène, on se rend vite compte que la structure du duel est très directive, une contrainte qui donne en fait une grande liberté pour construire la chorégraphie. Rappelons la structure. Première touche d'Hamlet, récusée par la herte, mais confirmée par Osric. Seconde touche d'Hamlet, acceptée par la herte. Troisième assaut, coup nu. Puis, blessure d'Hamlet par la herte, précédée ou suivie par « à nous maintenant », selon le choix de la mise en scène. Échange des armes, blessure de la herte par Hamlet, le tout accéléré par l'empoisonnement involontaire de la reine et la menace de la découverte du complot. Alors, on va peut-être vous le montrer, parce qu'à partir de là, on peut faire toutes sortes de choix pour chorégraphier ce duel, pourvu qu'il soit cohérent avec l'interprétation de la mise en scène, dans la façon que les personnages ont de se battre et révélatrice de leurs enjeux émotionnels respectifs. Donc, merci. J'ai choisi de Hamlet. Pierre va faire l'air. Donc, on travaille doucement, c'est histoire de vous montrer un peu comment ça se passe. Donc, il y a une mise en garde, il y a déjà, dès le départ, une arme non émoussée, que je ne peux pas voir, et une arme émoussée. Voilà. Donc, premier combat, une touche que récuse notre ami Gaël. Donc, par exemple, ah non, bah aussi. Une touche assez rapide. Je la refais parce que c'est insupportable, quoi. On commence, on dit non. Oui, touche, jugement, et Osric, oui, touche. Deuxième touche. Hop. Ah oui. Pour la face? Oui. Allez, on va faire. Ça pourrait être autre chose. Hein. Oui, touché. Donc, Osric, ok, il s'est fait avoir. Troisième assaut, il y a une série de combats. Et puis là, ça finit par un coup nul. Et là, c'est maintenant que ça devient intéressant. À vous maintenant. Là, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Les armements. On va ici, enlever. Je fais la même chose. D'accord? Deuxième possibilité. Absolument. Il a un peu tombé par terre. À vous maintenant. Non, mais un vrai combat, il est de. Ils sont tous, ils vont voir rouler. Là, j'ai trois unités. On va la sienne. Et là, continue, combat, même pratique. Là, voilà. Et vous pourrez dans le combat. Après, le reste, vous savez. Donc, troisième possibilité, puis il y en a encore d'autres, hein, on vous en montre trois. Donc, troisième possibilité. Ah! Oui. vais reprendre ma place. Hein.
À vous maintenant.
Le plus bas. Alors ça, c'est une interprétation de metteur en scène, dans le sens où, souvenez-vous, que mais je me bats contre mon honneur. Donc il est vraiment, il n'est pas monobloc, là. Moi, c'est une version qui m'intéresse bien. C'est ce que j'avais monté avec Graf, dans les papiers. Je peux toucher. Je ne peux plus faire. Ok, j'ai fait. Donc il accepte d'abord. Voilà, plusieurs interprétations. Mais il y en a encore plein d'autres. Hein.
Un peu nul, c'est pas très. Je comprends pas comment c'est nul.
Alors, bonne question. Pourquoi c'est nul? Il faut savoir qu'à l'époque, avec le fleuret moderne, on peut se toucher. À l'époque, on ne se touchait pas. Pourquoi là, regardez, si son épée est en bas, il est là c'est pas mieux, c'est le point. Si les deux épées sont ici, c'est les deux. Donc, je n'ai pas touché ici. Il aurait pu faire ça. Alors, il y a des positions où il fait juste ça, pardon, scratch. Pourquoi pas aussi? Mais il faut que ça reste visuel. Il faut que ça, voilà. Donc, un petit coup comme ça peut marcher peut-être au cinéma, mais au théâtre, c'est pas ce. Donc, il y a plein de choses différentes. Et après, il y a la femme qui s'aperçoit. Alors, là, il y a eu un petit désarmement, mais au XIXe siècle, les auteurs français, les maîtres d'art, etc., il y a eu des pages de littérature sur la manière, comment amener des armes, l'air pour prendre des épées. Il y a même un auteur qui a dit il y a un coup de tonnerre. C'est vrai. Par contre, alors, les désarmements, il y a plein de possibilités de désarmement. Par exemple, je pars ici, regardez, voilà, je peux faire ça. Tu pars à ce point-là, voilà, ici, voilà, regardez. Donc, c'est-à-dire que c'est des principes de point de levier. Faites-moi la tête, voilà, ici, voilà. Tous des armes, mais en même temps. Voilà, voilà, faites-moi ici, voilà, voilà, regardez. Voilà. Donc, c'est vraiment un travail sur le levier. C'est de la mécanique. Donc, après, on peut faire des désarmements comme ça, très, très spectaculaires, qui sont des vrais désarmements. Pourquoi? Je dirais que, même si l'escrime n'a pas une place aussi importante dans toutes les pièces de Shakespeare que dans Hamlet, elle est quand même toujours extrêmement significative parce qu'elle est un indice majeur de l'époque, de sa violence, de ses codes, de son actualité, de l'influence culturelle considérable de l'Italie, mais aussi parce que l'escrime constitue comme un langage à l'intérieur du texte par son lexique, principalement italien, par les métaphores qu'elles inspirent et par le pouvoir qu'elle a de propulser le drame et de révéler les personnages. Dans la pratique, on constate que l'escrime est comme le texte, éclairé par son histoire, soumise à des règles, mais toujours ouverte à l'interprétation. Et pour cela, exactement comme le texte, elle exige dans sa mise en scène le même soin, les mêmes recherches et les mêmes questions. Je vous remercie de votre attention.